Welcome, dear listener, to this cozy corner of history. Come, rest your weary head, and let me spin for you the tales of a time long past. Before we begin our journey into the Middle Ages, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Are you nestled beneath the covers, ready to drift off to sleep? Or perhaps you're just settling in for a bit of calming history to unwind after a long day. If you enjoy these quiet musings on days gone by, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. There's something quite special about letting the past whisper in your ear as you relax. Now, let us set the scene. Imagine, if you will, a small medieval village at the first light of dawn. The air is crisp and cool, the sky just beginning to blush with streaks of pink and gold. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, heralding the start of a new day. Slowly, the village begins to stir. Thatch-roofed huts emit plumes of smoke as peasant families kindle the fires that will warm their meagre meals. The scent of wood smoke mingles with the earthy aroma of livestock, cattle lowing softly in their pens, awaiting the touch of the milkmaid's hands, pigs rooting contentedly in their sties. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer rings out, ting, 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 as he stokes the flames of his forge, preparing for a long day spent shaping iron. These are the sights, sounds, and smells that would greet a medieval peasant each morning, a familiar tapestry woven from hardship and toil. For to be a peasant in the Middle Ages was to be caught in the grip of an unrelenting cycle of backbreaking labour, eked out beneath the oppressive weight of the feudal system. Most peasants lived in small, one-room huts, their roofs thatched with straw that would rot away every few years, needing to be painstakingly replaced. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden strips plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and the straw. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space for an entire family, their bedding nothing more than piles of straw laid out on the dirt floor. Furniture was simple and sparse, perhaps a wooden table and bench, a chest for storing precious items, and if the family was lucky, a straw mattress tick for the parents. Children would sleep on the floor or in the loft above the animals' quarters, where the rising heat would keep them warm in winter. Food was as basic as the living conditions. Most peasants subsisted on a diet of coarse barley bread, pottage, a stew of grains and vegetables, and whatever meagre produce they could grow in their cottage gardens. Meat was a rare luxury, usually only enjoyed on special occasions, or when an animal was too old or sick to be useful anymore. Even ale, the mainstay beverage of the time, was weak and watery, drunk more for its caloric content than for pleasure. Water was often too polluted to drink, especially in towns and cities, so ale was consumed by everyone from children to the elderly. This meagre fare, combined with the constant toll of manual labour, meant that most peasants were perpetually malnourished. They were prone to a host of diseases that their overworked bodies struggled to fight off. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and the dreaded bubonic plague that periodically swept through Europe like a scythe, culling the population without mercy. As a result, life expectancy was shockingly low. A peasant was considered fortunate to reach the age of 40. Many children died before their 5th birthday, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and infant, with many women perishing in the throes of labour or from postpartum infections. Yet despite the odds stacked against them, the peasantry endured. They toiled from sunup to sundown, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the whims of their lords. For in the feudal hierarchy, peasants occupied the lowest rung, beholden to the aristocracy for the very land they tilled. The feudal system was a complex web of obligations and loyalties, with the king at the apex and the lowly serf at the base. In between were the great lords and ladies, dukes, earls, barons and knights who held vast tracts of land granted to them by the king. In exchange for this land, known as a fief, the nobles pledged their fealty and military service to the crown. But they didn't work the land themselves. That fell to the peasants, who were bound to the nobles' estates in a form of indentured servitude. In exchange for the right to farm a small plot for their own sustenance, peasants were obliged to work the lord's fields, tend his livestock, repair his fences and buildings, and pay him a portion of their harvest in rent. It was a life of unceasing labour and little reward. There were two main classes of peasants: freemen and villeins. Freemen, as the name implies, enjoyed slightly more autonomy than their villain counterparts. Though still beholden to their lords, they could own their own tools and animals, and even save up enough money to buy their freedom. Villeins, on the other hand, were little more than slaves. They were bound to the land, forbidden to leave the estate without their lord's permission. They could own no property of their own, and were subject to their lord's justice and whims. If a villain died without an heir, all his possessions would revert back to his lord. But whatever their legal status, all peasants shared the same daily grind. They awoke at dawn, often to the crowing of a rooster or the clanging of the church bell. After a hasty morning meal, they would set off to the fields, shepherding their animals ahead of them, cows to the pasture, pigs to the forest to forage for acorns and roots, sheep to the hills. In spring, the ploughman would hitch his team of oxen to the heavy wooden plough, the blade biting deep into the earth as he trudged up and down the long furrows. It was grueling work, the sun beating down on his back, the flies buzzing incessantly around the sweating beasts. At the end of each row, he would pause to wipe his brow, then heave on the plough handles to turn the cumbersome contraption around for another pass. Once the soil was tilled, the sower would walk the field, scattering precious seed from a sack slung around his neck. He had to be careful not to sow too thickly or too thinly. Too much seed would choke out the young plants, while too little would leave gaps for weeds to take hold. And all the while he had to contend with flocks of hungry birds that would swoop down to feast on the newly planted grain. In summer, the peasants would keep a watchful eye on their ripening crops, guarding them against marauding animals and thieves. They would spend long hours weeding, hoeing, and stamping out insect infestations all under the blazing sun. At harvest time, the whole village would mobilize to bring in the precious grain before the rains came. Men, women, and children alike would take up scythes and sickles, working from dawn to dusk to cut and bind the wheat into sheaves. It was a race against time and weather, for a single storm could spell disaster, flattening the ripe grain and rotting it on the stalk. Once the harvest was in, the sheaves had to be threshed to separate the grain from the chaff. This was done with a flail, two wooden sticks joined by a short chain, which the thresher would swing overhead to beat the sheaves, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud echoing across the fields. The grain then had to be winnowed, tossed into the air so the breeze could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier kernels to fall to the ground. Finally, it would be gathered up and taken to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour, the miller taking his cut of the proceeds. No part of the harvest was wasted. The straw would be used to thatch roofs, stuff mattresses, or feed livestock. Any gleanings left in the field after reaping were free for the poor to gather, a tradition dating back to biblical times. While the men toiled in the fields, the women had their own unending round of chores. They milked the cows, churned butter, made cheese, baked bread, brewed ale, spun wool, wove cloth, sewed clothing, tended the cottage garden, gathered firewood, drew water from the well, and cooked what little food there was. Peasant children, too, had to pull their weight. As soon as they were old enough to walk, they would be put to work, scaring birds from the crops, gathering eggs, picking vegetables, herding geese or sheep. There was no time for schooling or play. childhood was a brief respite before a lifetime of labor. Even the elderly and infirm were expected to contribute what they could, whether it was spinning, weaving, mending, or tending the fire. There was no retirement for a peasant. You worked until you died. Such was the lot of the medieval peasant, a life of unremitting toil and hardship, their fates yoked to the land and their lords. But among these humble folk, there were some whose names have echoed down through the ages. Their stories are testament to the endurance and spirit of the common man. One such figure was William Langland, a 14th century ploughman turned poet. Born into a poor peasant family, Langland spent his youth behind the plough, his hands calloused from gripping the rough wooden handles, his face weathered by sun and wind. But Langland had a restless mind and a burning desire for knowledge. In the brief moments of respite between his labours, he would listen intently to the parish priest's sermons, committing the Bible stories to memory. He learned to read and write, rare accomplishments for a peasant, and began to compose his own verses. Langland's masterpiece was Piers Ploughmen, a sprawling allegorical poem that chronicled the journey of a humble everyman, the titular Piers, through a landscape of social injustice and religious corruption. Through Piers' eyes, Langland laid bare the inequities of the feudal system, the greed of the nobility, and the hypocrisy of the church. He gave voice to the plight of the peasantry, their backbreaking labour and grinding poverty, their yearning for a better life. In one memorable passage, Piers laments, "I have no penny pullets for to buy, nor neither geese nor pigs, but 2 green cheeses, a few curds and cream, and an oaten cake, and 2 loaves of beans and bran, baked for my youngsters. And yet I say by my soul, I have no salt bacon. Not a smidgen of smoked meat smoulders in my sideboards." Langland's words struck a chord with the common folk, who saw in Piers a champion of their cause. Piers Ploughmen became a sensation, circulating widely in manuscript form long before the invention of the printing press. It's a testament to Langland's genius that his poem has endured for over 6 centuries, a window into the world of the medieval peasant and a cry for social justice that still resonates today. For Langland, writing was a way to transcend the narrow confines of his peasant life, to give voice to the voiceless and to dream of a better world. In the figure of Piers, he created an enduring symbol of the common man's struggle, a simple ploughman who, through faith and fortitude, could lead his people to a more just and equitable society. Langland's own life remains shrouded in mystery. We know little of his final years or his ultimate fate. But his legacy lives on in the pages of Piers Ploughmen, a reminder that even in the darkest and most oppressive of times, the human spirit can still soar free on the wings of imagination and hope. As we leave William Langland and his ploughman hero behind, we turn our attention to another group of peasants whose lives were inextricably bound to the land and the creatures that roamed upon it, the shepherds and goat herds. In many ways, the shepherd's life was even more solitary and arduous than that of the ploughman or reaper. While field workers at least had the companionship of their fellow labourers, the shepherd spent long days and nights alone with his flock, wandering the hillsides and valleys in search of pasture. It was a job that required great skill and knowledge. A good shepherd had to be attuned to the needs and habits of his animals, able to read the subtle signs of weather and predators. He had to know which plants were safe for his sheep to graze on and which were poisonous, how to nurse a sick lamb back to health, how to deliver a breech birth ewe. He also had to be prepared to defend his flock against a host of dangers, wolves and wild dogs, thieves and rustlers, even the occasional bear or mountain lion. Armed with little more than a staff and a sling, the shepherd had to be ready to lay down his life for his sheep. It was a lonely existence, with only the bleating of the flock and the occasional bark of the herding dog for company. Shepherds would often go weeks or even months without seeing another human face. their only shelter a crude lean-to or a cave in the hillside. In the heat of summer, they would lead their flocks to high mountain pastures, following the retreating snow line. There, in the thin, crisp air, the sheep would graze on the lush alpine grasses, putting on fat for the long winter ahead. As autumn approached, the shepherds would begin the long drive back down to the lowlands, the sheep's wool heavy with the summer's growth. It was a treacherous journey, the narrow mountain paths slick with ice and snow, the threat of avalanches and rockfalls ever present. Once back in the valley, the sheep would be penned in stone-walled enclosures, the wool shorn and spun into yarn for clothing and blankets. The shepherd's work was never done. Even in the depths of winter, he had to keep a watchful eye on his flock, ensuring they were fed and sheltered from the bitter cold. It was a hard life, but one that had its rewards. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing that your skill and dedication kept your animals safe and thriving, that the wool on people's backs and the meat on their tables was the fruit of your labours. And in the quiet moments, when the sun was setting over the hills and the sheep were settled for the night, the shepherd could find solace in the beauty of the landscape around him, the play of light on the grass, the song of a lark overhead, the distant tinkle of a mountain stream. For some, this close communion with nature could be a source of great spiritual comfort. Many shepherds were deeply devout, seeing in their humble work an echo of the divine. After all, was not Christ himself often depicted as a shepherd, tending to his flock of faithful with loving care? This spiritual dimension of the shepherd's life is beautifully captured in the English medieval carol, The Shepherd's Song, which imagines a group of shepherds on the night of Christ's birth. The shepherd upon a hill he sat. He had on him his tabard and his hat, his tar box, his pipe, and his flaget. His name was called Jolly Wat, for he was a good herds boy. The carol goes on to describe how the shepherds are visited by an angel who tells them of the Saviour's birth, and how they hasten to Bethlehem to pay homage to the newborn king. The shepherds ran to Bethlehem to see that blessed sun's beam, and there they found that glorious leam, Mary and Joseph in their reign, and Jesus Christ, God's Son. For the medieval peasant, the story of the Nativity would have had a special resonance. The idea that God himself had chosen to be born not in a palace, but in a lowly stable, surrounded by the humble beasts of the field. It was a reminder that even the most lowly and marginalized of people had worth in the eyes of the divine, that there was a spiritual dimension to even the most menial of tasks. Of course, not all shepherds were saintly figures. Like any group of people, they had their share of rogues and scoundrels, those who would steal from their neighbours' flocks or neglect their own animals in favour of drink and dice. But by and large, the shepherd was a respected figure in medieval society, his knowledge and skill highly valued by the community. In an age where wool was one of the most important commodities, a good shepherd could command a decent wage and enjoy a measure of social status. So the next time you don a woolen sweater or curl up under a warm blanket, spare a thought for the medieval shepherd, the solitary figure on the hillside, his watchful eyes and steady hand guiding his flock through the changing seasons. His simple faith, a beacon in a world of toil and uncertainty. As we leave the pastures and hillsides behind, we descend into the dark, dank world of the medieval city, a place of narrow, winding streets, overhanging timber. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the thatched roofs of the village, the peasants stirred from their slumber. The roosters crowed, heralding the start of another long, laborious day. Men, women, and children rose from their straw-filled mattresses, their breath visible in the chill morning air. They broke their fast on a meagre meal of coarse bread and weak ale, fuel for the toil that lay ahead. Life for a medieval peasant was a harsh and unrelenting struggle. They dwelled in small, cramped huts, their earthen floors strewn with rushes to keep out the damp and cold. A hearth fire filled the single room with smoke, and a rough-hewn table and stools served as the only furnishings. Windows were mere slits in the walls, shuttered against the elements. Privacy was unknown. Entire families shared the same living space, sleeping side by side on pallets. Peasants were bound to the land, subservient to the lords and nobles who owned the vast estates. The feudal system that dominated medieval society left little room for autonomy or advancement. A peasant's lot was fixed from birth, tilling the same soil as their ancestors, marrying within their class, and passing on their meagre possessions to their children. They were born into servitude and would likely die in servitude, their brief lives marked by unremitting hardship. The rhythm of a peasant's day was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. They woke at first light, often to the sound of church bells tolling matins. After a sparse breakfast, they set about their appointed tasks. Men headed to the fields to tend to crops and livestock. Women fed the children, collected eggs, milked cows, and drew water from the village well. They baked bread, brewed ale, and tended vegetable gardens. Even the youngest children had chores, scaring birds from the seedbeds, gathering firewood, or helping with the washing. Meals were simple affairs, eaten in haste so as not to waste precious daylight. At midday, peasants would break for a meal of cheese, onions, and bread, washed down with watered wine or ale. Meat was a rare luxury, eaten only on special occasions or when an animal fell ill and had to be slaughtered. The evening meal was a thin pottage of vegetables and grains, sometimes enriched with a scrap of salted pork or fish on feast days. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, peasants returned to their huts, bone-weary and hungry. They ate their paltry supper and fell into an exhausted sleep, only to rise and begin the whole backbreaking cycle again a few hours later. It was a life of grinding poverty and relentless drudgery, with little respite or hope of change. Perhaps the most arduous and vital work of the peasantry took place in the fields. The ploughman's job was to till the heavy, clay-rich soil from dawn to dusk, walking behind a lumbering ox or horse-drawn plough. It was slow, exhausting labour, requiring great strength and endurance. The plough itself was a primitive implement, little more than a sharpened stick that scratched the surface of the earth. The ploughman had to constantly adjust its depth and angle while dodging rocks and roots that could break the blade. Even a skilled ploughman could only till about an acre a day, a small plot that would yield barely enough food to sustain a family. The work was made harder by the crude state of medieval agriculture. Fields were divided into long, narrow strips, separated by raised banks of turf. This was to allow access for ploughing and sowing, but it meant that a farmer might have strips scattered across the manor, requiring them to travel long distances just to reach their land. Once the soil was turned, the sower took over, scattering precious seed by hand. It was a delicate task, requiring a steady hand and a keen eye for the wind. Too much seed in one place would choke the young plants, while too little would result in bare patches. Birds were a constant menace, swooping down to snatch up the freshly sown grain. Sowers sometimes resorted to shouting, waving flags, or even employing young children to run up and down the furrows to scare them off. All of this was for naught if the weather didn't cooperate. A dry spring could parch the seedlings, while heavy rains could wash them away or rot them in the ground. Hail and high winds could flatten a field in minutes, destroying months of hard work. It was a precarious existence, wholly dependent on the whims of nature. The harvest was the most critical and back-breaking time of the agricultural year. As the wheat and barley ripened under the summer sun, peasants worked from sunrise to sunset to bring in the crop before the rains came. Armed with sickles and scythes, they systematically moved through the fields, cutting the grain and tying it into sheaves. It was hot, dusty, itchy work. The sharp stalks left hands blistered and bleeding, while pollen and chaff choked the air. Once cut, the sheaves had to be gathered and hauled to the threshing floor, where the grain would be separated from the stalks. This required immense physical strength. A single sheaf could weigh up to 30 pounds. Men, women, and older children all pitched in, loading the sheaves onto carts or carrying them on their backs. It was a race against time, for a rainstorm could ruin the cut grain, causing it to sprout or spoil. One figure who captured the hardships and dignity of the medieval ploughman was William Langland. Born around 1332 in the West Midlands of England, Langland came from a family of small freeholders, or yeomen. As a young man, he likely worked the land himself, following the plough across the rolling hills and fertile valleys of his native Malvern. But Langland was also a man of letters, educated at a monastery school and possibly even at Oxford. In the 1360s, he began work on his masterpiece, Piers Ploughmen, an allegorical dream vision that blends social satire with spiritual seeking. The poem's central figure is the virtuous ploughman Piers, who embodies the ideal of honest labour and Christian humility. Through Piers, Langland gives voice to the plight of the common man in a time of great upheaval. The 14th century was marked by the devastation of the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the breakdown of the feudal order. Peasants were increasingly squeezed by heavy taxation and labour shortages, while the church and nobility grew ever more corrupt and oppressive. Langland channeled these frustrations into biting social commentary. In one memorable scene, he describes a field full of idlers, beggars, vagabonds, and friars, all shirking honest work. Piers appears and sets them straight, admonishing them to put your sickles in the corn and earn their keep like true Christians. It was a radical message for the time, elevating the status of manual labour and calling out the hypocrisy of the ruling classes. Yet, Piers Ploughmen is also a deeply spiritual work, reflecting Langland's own quest for meaning and salvation. Piers himself is a Christ-like figure, leading the dreamer on a pilgrimage towards divine truth. The poem grapples with weighty theological questions, the nature of sin and redemption, the role of grace and good works, the path to eternal life. For Langland, the answer lay in the simple dignity of the ploughman's life. By toiling humbly in the fields, in service to God and community, one could find a measure of grace amid the hardships of the world. It was a message that resonated with the common folk, and Piers Ploughmen became one of the most widely read works of the Middle Ages. Langland himself remained something of a mystery, even to his contemporaries. He seems to have spent much of his life as a poor cleric in London, eking out a living by saying prayers for wealthy patrons. He may have fallen on hard times. In one haunting passage, he describes himself as clothed in rough cloth, my covering a hard bed. Yet he never lost his sharp eye for the follies and injustices of his age. In the end, Langland's legacy was to give voice to the voiceless, to capture the joys and sorrows, the hopes and fears of the common man. His ploughman Piers became a folk hero, a symbol of the enduring spirit of the labouring classes. In a time when most literature was written by and for the elite, Langland spoke for the masses, affirming the dignity and worth of even the lowliest peasant. As we imagine Langland following his plough across the fields, his weather-beaten hands gripping the handles, his mind spinning out visions of sin and salvation, we can't help but be moved by his example. He reminds us of the profound humanity that can be found in even the most humble of lives, and the power of literature to give shape and meaning to the struggles of the common man. So let us pause for a moment as the sun rises over the thatched roofs and the ploughman begins his weary trudge across the furrows to remember William Langland and the countless unnamed peasants who toiled in obscurity, yet whose labours sustained a civilization. In their quiet strength and endurance, in their stubborn quest for meaning amid hardship, we may just catch a glimpse of the divine. For tending to animals was no less arduous than working the land. Medieval peasants relied heavily on livestock for food, clothing, and draft power. They raised cattle for milk and meat, sheep for wool and parchment, pigs for bacon and lard, chickens for eggs and feathers, and draft horses and oxen for ploughing and hauling. Caring for these creatures was a constant responsibility, requiring early mornings, long days, and late nights. Perhaps the most iconic figure of medieval animal husbandry was the shepherd. Charged with guarding the manor's flocks of sheep, shepherds led a lonely, wandering life on the edges of society. They spent their days roaming the hillsides and meadows, watching over their charges as they grazed. It was a job that required great patience, vigilance, and courage. Sheep were highly vulnerable to predators like wolves and wild dogs, which could decimate a flock overnight. Shepherds had to be constantly on the alert, ready to fend off attackers with their staffs and slings. They also had to protect the sheep from human threats, thieves and rustlers who would steal lambs or fleeces under cover of darkness. To guard against these dangers, shepherds often slept out in the open, wrapped in thick woolen cloaks against the cold night air. They subsisted on a diet of bread, cheese, and ale, supplemented by the occasional lamb or ewe culled from the flock. It was a hard, solitary existence, with little human contact beyond the occasional encounter with other shepherds or travellers on the road. Yet shepherding also had its quiet joys and satisfactions. Shepherds developed a deep knowledge of their local landscape, the best grazing spots, the safest watering holes, the paths and landmarks that could guide them home. They learned to read the weather in the clouds and winds, to predict storms and showers, and they took pride in the health and vitality of their flocks, knowing that their skill and dedication made possible the wool and mutton that sustained the manor. Goat herds followed a similar way of life, leading their nimble, mischievous charges to pasture in scrubby hills and rocky outcroppings. Goats were prized for their milk, cheese, and meat, but they were notoriously difficult to keep in check. They would eat almost anything, including precious crops and vegetables, and were prone to wandering off or getting stuck in precarious spots. Goat herds needed a quick eye and a firm hand to keep their herds under control. The lowliest of the pastoral professions was undoubtedly the swineherd. Pigs were considered unclean animals in medieval society, associated with filth, gluttony, and sin. They were often left to roam free in forests and woodlands, foraging for acorns, roots, and small game. It was the swineherd's job to keep track of these unruly creatures and drive them to market when the time came. It was a dirty, thankless task, looked down upon by the other villagers. Swineherds spent their days trudging through muddy, tangled underbrush, shouting and whistling to keep the pigs in line. They were constantly covered in muck and mire, and the stench of the animals clung to their hair and clothing. Even their homes on the outskirts of the village were shunned, as if the very presence of pigs could contaminate by association. Yet even among the rough and tumble world of swineherds, there were those who found a measure of purpose and belonging. Consider the peculiar tale of Johanna, a young woman who found herself tending geese for a wealthy landowner in the 14th century Germany. Johanna was a serf, bound to her lord's estate from birth. As a child, she had shown a knack for handling birds, calming skittish hens, coaxing geese to nest, and collecting eggs with gentle hands. When the manor's goose girl died of the pox, Johanna was chosen to take her place, much to the surprise of all who knew her as a shy, retiring sort. At first, Johanna relished her new role. She spent her days leading the honking, waddling geese to the best patches of grass and clover, watching them snap up insects and preen their feathers in the sun. She marveled at their complex social lives, the way they paired off in mated couples, fiercely defending their nests and goslings. She even grew fond of their distinct personalities, the bold gander who always led the flock, the fussy mother who fretted over every eggshell. But as the months wore on, Johanna began to feel the weight of her solitude. The other villagers looked askance at the strange girl who spent all her time with birds, muttering and singing to herself as she wandered the fields. They whispered that she was touched in the head, or worse, that she consorted with dark powers to keep her flock in line. The rumors came to a head when a series of misfortunes befell the village. Cows went dry, crops withered in the fields, and a sickly green mist hung over the mill pond. The superstitious villagers were quick to point the finger at Johanna, claiming she had cursed them with her uncanny ways. They demanded that the Lord do something about his unnatural servant. Johanna's fate hung in the balance, her life and livelihood threatened by the very creatures she had come to love. In the end, it was the geese themselves who saved her, or so the story goes. When the Lord's men came to drag Johanna away, the geese surrounded her in a honking, flapping circle, refusing to let anyone near. The Lord, impressed by their loyalty, declared that no one who inspired such devotion could be a witch, and let Johanna go free. From that day on, Johanna was left in peace to tend her feathered charges. She lived out her days on the fringes of the village, finding solace in the simple rhythms of the seasons and the company of her birds. And though she remained an outsider to the end, whispers of her strange gifts and uncanny bond with nature would echo through the generations, a reminder of the magic that could be found in even the humblest of lives. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, we leave Johanna amid her contented flock, their soft honks and rustles fading into the distance. Her story is a testament to the quiet strength and resilience of the medieval peasantry, the way they carved out pockets of meaning and beauty in a world that often seemed cold and unyielding. In tending to their animals, they found not just sustenance, but a sense of purpose and connection that sustained them through even the darkest of times. Let us turn now to the Lord's own estate, where a different sort of drudgery awaited the lowliest of serfs. For while the fields and pastures might offer a certain wild freedom, the confines of the manor house and its outbuildings were a hive of ceaseless toil, governed by the whims and demands of the master and his family. Perhaps no job was more loathed and reviled than that of the gong farmer. In a time before modern sanitation, the disposal of human waste was a critical and unpleasant necessity. Cesspits and latrines had to be regularly emptied to prevent disease and stench from overtaking the household. It fell to the gong farmers to wade into these fetid pits and haul out the muck and filth with buckets and shovels. It was a grueling and nauseating task, one that even the most hardened labourers sought to avoid. The stink of human waste was overpowering, clinging to hair and skin long after the work was done. The gong farmers were constantly exposed to noxious fumes and disease-ridden sludge, making them prone to illness and infection. They were shunned by the rest of the household staff, forced to eat and sleep separately to avoid spreading the contagion. Yet even in this degrading work, there were flashes of humanity and camaraderie. Gong farmers often worked in pairs or teams, relying on each other for support and safety as they descended into the murky depths. They developed their own crude humour and rituals to cope with the vileness of their task, swapping bawdy jokes and quips as they shove. As the first golden rays of dawn pierced the morning mist, the peasants of Elmwood village began to stir. The cock's crow echoed through the thatch-roofed huts, signalling the start of another long day of labour. Men, women and children rose from their straw pallets, joints stiff from the damp chill that seeped through the walls. They broke their fast on a meagre meal of pottage, a thin gruel of boiled grains and vegetables, before setting out to toil in the fields and pastures. Life was hard for these peasants, beholden to the land and the feudal lords who ruled over them. From sunup to sundown, they worked the soil, tended to livestock, and performed countless other backbreaking tasks, all for the privilege of eking out a bare subsistence living. Most could expect to live only 30 or 40 years, their bodies worn down by malnutrition, disease, and unrelenting toil. As the villagers dispersed to their labours, let us follow in the footsteps of the ploughman as he made his way to the fields. With a crude iron plough hitched to a pair of oxen, he faced the daunting task of tilling acres of rich but heavy soil. The plough was a simple but crucial tool, little changed since Roman times. Little more than a wooden frame with an iron coulter to cut the sod and a mouldboard to turn it over, it nonetheless transformed European agriculture in the Middle Ages. The ploughman's work was grueling and repetitive. He had to keep the plough straight and level, no easy feat when contending with rocks, roots, and clumps of grass. Guiding the oxen required constant vigilance and occasional goading with a goad or whip. At the end of each long furrow, he had to heave on the plough handles to turn the team around and begin the next pass. Hour after hour, he trudged across the field, leaving a neat pattern of dark, upturned earth in his wake. One man who captured the hardships and quiet dignity of the medieval ploughman was William Langland. Born around 1330 in the West Midlands of England, Langland spent much of his life as a humble tonsured cleric, eking out a living however he could. But he is best remembered as the author of Piers Ploughmen, a visionary work of alliterative verse that offers a searing portrait of feudal society. In the poem, Langland introduces a humble ploughman named Piers who embodies the virtues of hard work, honesty, and Christian charity. Through Piers, Langland voices the struggles and aspirations of the common folk, toiling under the yoke of poverty and oppression. He laments the corruption of the church and the greed of the nobility, calling for a return to a simpler, more righteous way of life. Though little is known of Langland's own life, it's tempting to see echoes of his experiences in the vivid descriptions of rural labour in Piers Ploughmen. In one memorable passage he writes, "In a summer season when soft was the sun, I clothed myself in a cloak as I shepherd were, habit like a hermit unholy of works, went wide in this world wonders to hear." Langland may have spent time as a shepherd or ploughman in his youth, giving him first-hand knowledge of the backbreaking toil that was the peasants' lot. His empathy for their plight shines through in the character of Piers, who becomes a Christ-like figure, leading the people toward redemption. As the ploughman in Elmwood village finished the last furrow and unhitched his weary oxen, perhaps he took some small comfort in knowing that a poet like Langland had given voice to his struggles. But there was little time to reflect as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The sower was already scattering precious seed on the freshly turned earth, racing against time and weather to ensure a good crop come harvest time. The sower's task was one that required both skill and stamina. Carrying a heavy sack of seeds slung over one shoulder, he would march up and down the field, casting the grain in a wide arc with each step. The key was to maintain a steady rhythm and an even spread, ensuring that each square foot of soil received the optimal number of seeds. Too few and the harvest would be lean, too many and the crowded seedlings would choke each other out. But the sower's greatest enemy was the weather. A sudden downpour could wash away the carefully scattered seed, while a dry spell could parch the soil and prevent germination. And then there were the birds. Flocks of crows, pigeons and starlings that would descend on the freshly sown field, gorging themselves on the tasty morsels. To guard against such threats, the sower might resort to various tricks and charms. Some would mix the seed with bitter herbs or crushed pepper to deter birds, while others would recite rhyming incantations as they worked, invoking God and the saints to protect their precious crop. One popular medieval prayer went, "Holy Mary, Mother mild, bless the seed I sow this day. Let each grain spring forth and grow 100-fold to feed us all." Whether such charms had any real effect is doubtful, but they offered a measure of psychological comfort to the sower as he toiled beneath the hot sun. And when the last seed was cast and the empty sack folded away, he could only trust in providence and the benevolence of nature to bring forth a bountiful crop. As the sower finished his work and headed for a brief, hard-earned rest, the reaper was already sharpening his scythe in preparation for the harvest to come. Of all the tasks in the agricultural cycle, reaping the grain was perhaps the most physically demanding and time-sensitive. For a few crucial weeks in late summer, the entire community would mobilize to bring in the ripened wheat, barley, and rye before the autumn rains could ruin it. The reaper's tool was the scythe, a long curved blade attached to a wooden handle. Swinging it in a wide arc, he would cut a swath through the standing grain, letting it fall in a neat row behind him. Following close behind, a team of men and women would gather up the stalks and tie them into sheaves to be hauled away to the threshing floor. It was backbreaking work, requiring a strong arm and a steady hand. The reaper had to maintain a relentless pace, cutting as much grain as possible in the long daylight hours, stopping only for brief breaks to sharpen the blade or quench his thirst from a leather flask. He would toil from dawn to dusk, his shirt soaked with sweat and his muscles screaming with fatigue. Yet there was also a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose among the harvesters. The whole village would come together to bring in the crop, with even the youngest and oldest pitching in where they could. Songs and stories would help pass the time and lift flagging spirits, and there was always the promise of a harvest feast to look forward to when the last sheaf was gathered in. As the harvesters laboured in the golden fields, spare a thought for the humble shepherd, whose job was a lonely and often dangerous one. Charged with guarding the village's precious flocks of sheep and goats, the shepherd spent long days and nights out on the hillsides and pastures, exposed to the elements and the threat of predators. The shepherd's most important tool was his crook, a long staff with a hooked end used to catch and control wayward sheep. He would also carry a sling or a horn to fend off wolves or other beasts that might threaten the flock. But his greatest asset was his faithful dog, a constant companion and invaluable helper in managing the herd. The life of a shepherd was a solitary one, with long hours spent watching over the grazing animals. He had to be constantly alert for signs of trouble, a sickly ewe, a lost lamb, or a lurking predator. At night, he would pen the flock in a makeshift fold and take turns with his dog to keep watch, huddled beneath a rough woolen cloak for warmth. Despite the hardships, many shepherds took pride in their work and developed a deep bond with their charges. They would know each animal by sight and often give them affectionate names. In a world where most peasants had little control over their own lives, the shepherd enjoyed a degree of autonomy and self-reliance that was rare among his fellow villagers. One shepherd who embodied these qualities was Johanna, a young woman who lived in a small town in the German Duchy of Bavaria in the early 15th century. Johanna had been tending geese for a wealthy landowner since she was a child and had developed a reputation as a skilled and reliable goose girl. But Johanna's life took a dark turn when she was accused of witchcraft by some of the superstitious villagers. They claimed that she used her uncanny way with animals to cast spells and curses on her neighbours. Johanna was arrested and subjected to brutal interrogation by the local authorities, who were convinced that she was in league with the devil. Despite the lack of evidence against her, Johanna was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. As she was led to the pyre, she maintained her innocence and dignity, insisting that she was a simple goose girl who had done nothing wrong. According to legend, as the flames consumed her, the geese that she had tended for so long broke free from their enclosures and flew to her side, honking mournfully as if in tribute to their beloved mistress. Johanna's tragic story is a reminder of the precarious position of women in medieval society, particularly those who dared to live unconventional lives. As a shepherd and a single woman, Johanna defied the norms of her time and place and paid the ultimate price for it. Yet her memory lives on as a testament to the resilience and courage of the common folk, who faced adversity with grit and grace. From the lonely pastures to the bustling villages, the peasants of the Middle Ages toiled ceaselessly to keep their communities alive and functioning. And nowhere was this more evident than in the lowly but essential work of the swineherd. Charged with managing the village's herd of pigs, the swineherd was a figure of both necessity and disdain in medieval society. Pigs were a crucial source of meat for the peasantry, providing a reliable supply of protein that could be salted and stored for the lean winter months. But they were also dirty, unruly creatures that required constant supervision and care. It fell to the swineherd to drive the pigs out to the forests and fields each day to forage for acorns, roots, and other fodder. It was a dirty, thankless job that often involved wading through mud and muck and dealing with the pigs' stubborn and sometimes aggressive behavior. The swineherd would use a staff or a whip to keep the herd in line, and had to be constantly alert for signs of disease or injury among the animals. He also had to contend with the threat of thieves or wild animals that might try to make off with a tasty pig. But perhaps the greatest challenge for the swineherd was the social stigma that came with the job. In a world where cleanliness was next to godliness, the swineherd was seen as a filthy, low-class individual, barely a step above the animals he tended. He was often shunned by his fellow villagers and excluded from many of the social and religious rituals that bound the community together. Despite these hardships, the swineherd played a vital role in the village economy, ensuring a steady supply of pork for the tables of rich and poor alike. And like many of his fellow peasants, he found ways to carve out small moments of joy and meaning in a life of unrelenting toil. As the swineherd drove his herd back to the village at the end of a long day, he might take a moment to appreciate the beauty of the sunset over the fields, or to savor the simple pleasure of a hot meal and a warm fire. For in the face of hardship and adversity, it was these small things that made life bearable for the common folk of the Middle Ages. Indeed, the very lowliness and marginalization of the most humble peasants may have bred in them a special kind of resilience and fortitude. Take, for example, the story of Wat Tyler, a man who rose from obscurity as a roof tiler to become one of the most famous rebels in English history. Born in the mid-14th century in Kent, Tyler spent his early life toiling on church estates to earn a meagre living. Roofing was a skilled trade, but one that required long hours of dangerous work atop high buildings in all kinds of weather. Tyler may have been illiterate, but he was intelligent and charismatic, with a keen sense of the injustices faced by his fellow peasants. In 1381, those injustices boiled over into open rebellion, as thousands of peasants rose up against the oppressive poll taxes imposed by the young King Richard II and his unpopular ministers. Tyler emerged as one of the leaders of the revolt, commanding a large force of rebels who marched on London, burning and looting as they went. The rebels' demands were simple but far-reaching: an end to serfdom, the right to rent land at reasonable rates, and the removal of corrupt officials from power. For a brief moment, it seemed as if they might succeed, as the king himself was forced to meet with Tyler and the other leaders at Mile End. But the moment was short-lived. During a heated confrontation at Smithfield, Tyler was suddenly attacked and stabbed by the Mayor of London, William Walworth. As he lay dying, the king's men moved in to crush the rebellion, scattering the peasant army and hunting down its leaders. Tyler's death marked the end of the peasants' revolt, but his legacy lived on as a symbol of resistance against tyranny and oppression. In the centuries that followed, his name would be invoked by countless other rebels and reformers, from the Lollards to the Chartists. For the peasants of the Middle Ages, the story of Wat Tyler was a reminder that even the lowliest among them had the power to challenge the status quo and fight for a better life. It was a message that would resonate down through the generations, as the common folk continued to struggle against the yoke of feudalism and oppression. Of course, not all peasants were cut out for rebellion and revolt. For many, the daily grind of work and survival left little room for dreams of a better world, and few jobs were more grinding than that of the gong farmer, the unfortunate soul charged with cleaning out the village's cesspits and latrines. In a world without modern sanitation, human waste was a constant and noxious presence in medieval villages. It was the gong farmer's job to remove this waste and dispose of it safely. a task that required a strong stomach and a sturdy constitution. Armed with a long-handled scoop and a bucket, the gong farmer would descend into the dark, foul-smelling depths of the cesspit, wading through the muck to remove the accumulated waste. It was a job that exposed him to all manner of disease and infection, from dysentery to typhoid fever. But the gong farmer's work was essential to the health and well-being of the village. Without proper waste disposal, the streets and alleys would quickly become clogged with filth and vermin, breeding grounds for disease and pestilence. Despite the vital importance of their work, gong farmers were among the most despised and marginalized members of medieval society. They were often forced to live on the outskirts of the village, shunned by their neighbors and barred from many of the social and religious activities that bound the community together. Yet even in this lowly and unpleasant job, there were moments of humanity and compassion. One story tells of a gong farmer named John, who was called to clean out a cesspit at a local monastery. As he worked, he discovered a small malnourished child who had fallen into the pit and was near death. Without hesitation, John climbed down into the filth and rescued the child, cleaning him off and wrapping him in his own cloak. He then took the boy to the monastery infirmary, where he was nursed back to health by the monks. When the abbot of the monastery heard of John's selfless act, he was moved to reward him with a small plot of land and a new set of clothes. It was a rare moment of recognition for a man who toiled in obscurity and squalor, a reminder that even the lowliest among us have the capacity for kindness and compassion. As the gong farmer hauled his reeking buckets through the village streets, he may have taken some small comfort in the knowledge that his work, however unpleasant, was essential to the well-being of his community. And perhaps, like John, he held out hope that one day his efforts would be recognized and rewarded, if only in some small way. Hope was a precious commodity for the peasants of the Middle Ages, a flicker of light in a world of darkness and toil. And nowhere was that hope more sorely needed than among the poor souls who were tasked with excavating the village's ditches and trenches. Ditch digging was one of the most physically demanding and poorly compensated jobs in medieval society. It required long hours of backbreaking labour in all kinds of weather, with little more than a spade and a wheelbarrow to aid in the work. The ditch digger's task was to excavate the deep, narrow trenches that served as the village's primary means of drainage and defence. These ditches were essential for channeling away rainwater and sewage. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and thatched roofs of the village, the weary peasants make their way home after another long day of toil. Their aching muscles and calloused hands are a testament to the ceaseless labour that fills their waking hours. For most, there is little hope of ever escaping the crushing poverty and servitude that defines their lives. But even amidst the hardship, there are occasional reprieves that bring a glimmer of joy and respite to the downtrodden. The church feast days, though far too infrequent, offer a chance to set aside their tools and celebrate the saints with humble feasts and merrymaking. The harvest celebrations, when the last sheaves of grain are finally bundled and stored, are a time of music, dancing, and a few precious hours of revelry before the cycle of planting and reaping begins anew. And then there are the travelling minstrels, those wandering troubadours who occasionally pass through the villages, bringing with them tales of far-off lands, epic romances, and heroic deeds. For a few enchanted evenings, the peasants can lose themselves in the magic of storytelling, forgetting for a moment the grinding reality of their lives. The minstrels' melodies and ballads stir something in their hearts, a longing for adventure, for love, for a world beyond the confines of their village and the dictates of their feudal lords. It is this same yearning for something more that has, at times, driven the peasants to rise up against their oppressors. The dream of freedom, of casting off the yoke of serfdom and owning their own land, has inspired rebellions and uprisings throughout the Middle Ages. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by the charismatic rebel Wat Tyler, saw thousands of common folk march on London, demanding an end to the crippling taxes and abuses inflicted upon them by the ruling class. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed and Tyler himself brutally executed, it sent shockwaves through English society and sowed the seeds of resistance that would continue to grow in the hearts of the people. But for most peasants, open rebellion was a luxury they could ill afford. Their lives were an unending cycle of work, punctuated only by the briefest moments of rest and the constant spectre of hunger, disease, and the whims of their masters. They toiled from sunup to sundown, their fates inextricably tied to the land and the turning of the seasons. And yet, there is a quiet dignity in their struggle, a resilience born of necessity, and the unbreakable bonds of community and family. As the last light fades from the sky and the peasants settle into their humble homes, we are reminded of the countless generations who came before us, whose blood, sweat, and tears helped to build the foundations of the world we know today. Theirs was a life of unimaginable hardship, but also one of great strength, endurance, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be broken, even in the face of the most daunting odds. So let us remember the medieval peasants, not just as faceless figures from a distant past, but as individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and stories. From the inspiring tale of William Langland, the ploughman turned poet, to the peculiar legend of Johanna the goose girl, accused of witchcraft by superstitious villagers, each peasant had a unique tale to tell, even if history has largely forgotten them. And as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for those long-ago labourers whose lives were so different from our own, yet whose struggles and triumphs still resonate across the centuries. In honouring their memory, we pay tribute to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope in the face of adversity. For though the Middle Ages may seem like a distant and foreign land, the story of the peasants is, in many ways, the story of us all. A tale of hardship and heartbreak, but also of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity. So let us journey back one final time, to a world lit only by fire and the sweat of honest labour. As the peasants' weary eyes close and they drift off into a well-earned slumber, we too can allow ourselves to slip into the gentle embrace of sleep, secure in the knowledge that their legacy lives on in the very fabric of our modern world. And as we dream, perhaps we will catch a glimpse of those long-ago fields and villages, and the hardy souls who called them home, a reminder of how far we have come, and of the debt we owe to those who came before. But even as we sleep, the wheels of history continue to turn, slowly but inexorably. The seeds of change that were planted in the Middle Ages will one day bear fruit, as the old feudal order begins to crumble and new ideas and opportunities begin to take root. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration lie just over the horizon, waiting to transform the world in ways that even the most visionary peasant could never have imagined. And so we leave the medieval village behind, with its thatched roofs and muddy lanes, its hardships, and its small joys. The peasants will rise with the sun to begin another day of toil, their lives governed by the eternal rhythms of the land and the unyielding demands of their feudal masters. But even in the midst of their struggles, they carry within them the spark of something greater, the resilience, the ingenuity, and the unbreakable spirit that will one day help to shape the course of human history. As we bid farewell to the Middle Ages and all its trials and tribulations, let us carry with us the lessons of the peasants, the value of hard work, the power of community, and the enduring strength of the human heart. And let us never forget the countless generations of forgotten heroes who toiled in obscurity, whose blood and sweat and tears helped to build the world we know today. In the end, The story of the medieval peasants is a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and resilience can still flourish. And as we drift off into the gentle embrace of sleep, let us hold fast to that hope and to the knowledge that though the road ahead may be long and fraught with challenges, we carry within us the same strength and determination that sustained our ancestors through the ages. So let us sleep now and dream of a world transformed, where the backbreaking labour of the peasants has given way to new opportunities and new horizons. And let us awake with renewed purpose, ready to take up the torch that they have passed down to us, and to build a future that honours their sacrifice and their unwavering spirit. For in the end, the story of the peasants is the story of us all, a reminder of how far we have come and of the endless possibilities that lie ahead, waiting to be seized by those with the courage and the vision to reach for them. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, the weary peasants make their way home. Their backs ache from hours bent over crops, their hands rough and calloused from gripping tools. The air is filled with the earthy scent of soil and the pungent odour of farm animals. Despite the hardships of the day, there is a sense of satisfaction in a job well done, in the knowledge that their labour has wrung sustenance from the land. But for many, this contentment is fleeting. As they trudge down well-worn paths to their humble abodes, the reality of their lot in life weighs heavily upon them. They are bound to this land, to the whims of their lord, with little hope of ever breaking free from the cycle of poverty and servitude. Their days are an endless round of toil, their nights a brief respite before it all begins anew. Yet even in the midst of this bleak existence, there are moments of joy and celebration. The church feast days provide a welcome break from the drudgery, a chance to come together with family and friends, to share in the bounty of the harvest. The arrival of a travelling minstrel is a cause for excitement, bringing news from distant lands and tales of adventure to brighten the long evenings. And then there are the whispers of rebellion, the dream of freedom that stirs in the hearts of some. They have heard the stories of peasant uprisings in other parts of the land, of brave men and women who dared to stand up against their oppressors. Some even dare to hope that they too might one day cast off the yoke of servitude and claim a better life for themselves and their children. One such dreamer was Wat Tyler, a humble roof tiler from Kent. Born into poverty, Wat learned his trade at a young age and quickly gained a reputation for his skill and industry. But he was also known for his quick wit and his disdain for authority, traits that would serve him well in the years to come. As he travelled from village to village, plying his trade, Wat saw firsthand the suffering of his fellow peasants. He listened to their complaints of high taxes and corrupt officials, of the way they were treated like chattel by their lords. And he began to dream of a different world, one in which the common folk had a say in their own destiny. When the Peasants' Revolt erupted in 1381, Wat was quick to join the cause. He rallied his fellow tradesmen and labourers, urging them to take up arms against their oppressors. And as the rebellion gained momentum, Wat emerged as one of its leaders, a charismatic figure who inspired hope in the hearts of the downtrodden. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the peasants might actually succeed in their quest for freedom. They marched on London, tens of thousands strong, and presented their demands to the young King Richard II. But the king's promises of reform proved hollow, and the rebellion was eventually crushed by the nobility. Wat Tyler paid the ultimate price for his part in the uprising. He was brutally executed, his head mounted on a pike as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the status quo. But his legacy lived on, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the common man. As the peasants settle in for the night, huddled around the meagre warmth of their hearths, they cling to this spirit. They know that their lives are hard, that the odds are stacked against them, but they also know that they are not alone, that there are others who share their dreams of a better world. And so they persevere through the long years of the Middle Ages, through famine and plague and war. They toil in the fields and in the villages, in the great estates of the nobility, and on the lonely fringes of society. They are the backbone of this world, the unsung heroes whose labour and sacrifice will pave the way for the changes to come. As we look back on this time from the vantage point of the present day, it is easy to see the peasants as little more than a footnote in history, a downtrodden mass whose lives were brief and hard. But to do so would be to miss the true significance of their story. For in their struggles and their triumphs, in their dreams and their determination, the peasants of the Middle Ages laid the foundations for the world we know today. Their labour built the great cathedrals and castles that still stand as testaments to human ingenuity and skill. Their revolts and uprisings sowed the seeds of democratic thought and helped to chip away at the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system. And in their quiet moments, in the stories they told and the songs they sang, they left behind a rich cultural legacy that continues to resonate across the centuries. From the bawdy tales of Chaucer's Canterbury pilgrims to the haunting ballads of anonymous folk singers, the voice of the common man echoes down through history, reminding us of the enduring power of the human spirit. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the peasants of the Middle Ages, for the men and women who bore the weight of their world upon their shoulders. Let us remember their names and their deeds, their joys and their sorrows. And let us honour their memory by striving to build a world in which the dreams they dared to dream might one day become a reality. For in the end, the story of the peasants is the story of us all, of the common thread that binds humanity together across the ages. It is a story of hope and heartbreak, of struggle and perseverance, of the indomitable will to survive and thrive in the face of adversity. And it is a story that will continue to be told as long as there are those who labour and those who dream, those who toil and those who dare to imagine a better world. As the last embers of the hearth fire die out and the peasants drift off into slumber, the world outside grows still and silent. The fields and forests, the villages and towns, all are cloaked in darkness, waiting for the dawn of a new day. And in that darkness, the spirit of the peasants lives on, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart, to the unquenchable thirst for freedom and justice that burns within us all. So let us sleep now and dream of a world in which the peasants' dreams might one day come true. Let us rest in the knowledge that their struggle was not in vain, that their legacy lives on in the world we have built upon the foundations they laid. And let us awake to greet the dawn with renewed hope and purpose, ready to take up the task that they began so many centuries ago, the task of building a world in which all may live in dignity and peace. As the weary shepherds guided their flock back to the safety of the village, their bleating charges ambling along well-trodden paths, the sinking sun painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The day's labours were done, but tomorrow would bring more of the same, tending to the animals, keeping them safe from predators and thieves, and enduring the hardships of a life spent largely outdoors. For shepherds and goat herds there was little respite from the elements. They slept beneath the stars, wrapped in rough woolen cloaks, always alert for any signs of danger. Wolves prowled the edges of the forests, their howls piercing the night, while sneaky foxes crept in to snatch lambs that strayed too far from their mothers. And then there were the human threats, bandits and rustlers who would steal entire herds, leaving the shepherds to face the wrath of their lords. But despite the challenges, there was a certain peace to be found in the pastoral life. The gentle munching of the sheep as they grazed, the tinkling of bells around their necks, the soft bleating of newborn lambs. These were the sounds that filled the shepherd's days. They whiled away the long hours by carving intricate designs into wooden staffs, or playing simple tunes on reed pipes. Some even composed poetry, finding inspiration in the rugged beauty of the landscape. One such shepherd was a young man named Peter. He had been tending sheep since he was old enough to walk, learning the trade from his father and grandfather before him. Peter had a way with animals. He could calm a skittish ewe with a gentle word, or coax a wayward lamb back to the fold with a few well-placed whistles. He took pride in his work, knowing that the wool from his flock would be spun into warm clothing and the meat would feed hungry villagers. But Peter dreamed of a different life, one not bound by the whims of the weather or the demands of his lord. He had heard tales of the great cities where men could be free to choose their own path, to learn a trade or join a guild. He imagined himself as a master weaver, creating beautiful tapestries for noble houses, or a skilled mason, leaving his mark on grand cathedrals that would stand for centuries. For now, though, Peter's world was bounded by the rolling hills and verdant pastures of his lord's estate. He knew every inch of the land, from the babbling brooks where his flock stopped to drink to the shady groves where they sought shelter from the midday sun. He had even given names to some of his favourite sheep. There was old Bela, the matriarch of the flock, and little Milo, the runt who had surprised everyone by surviving a particularly harsh winter. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Peter settled down for another night in the open air. He gathered his cloak around him and leaned back against a gnarled oak tree, his faithful sheepdog curled up at his feet. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of the village, the barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a reminder that even in the solitude of the pastures, he was still part of a community, one that relied on the hard work of shepherds like him. As Peter drifted off to sleep, his mind wandered to the stories he had heard of great shepherds from the past. There was St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, who had tended sheep as a slave before becoming a bishop and spreading Christianity across the land, and King David of Israel, who had started out as a humble shepherd boy before slaying the giant Goliath and becoming one of the most renowned rulers in history. Peter knew he was unlikely to achieve such lofty heights, but he took comfort in the thought that even the greatest of men had once stood watch over a flock, just as he did now. With that, he closed his eyes and let the gentle bleating of his sheep lull him to sleep, ready to face another day in the life of a medieval shepherd. Of course, not all peasants who worked with animals had the relative peace and quiet of a shepherd's life. For those tasked with tending to pigs, the days were filled with the pungent smell of swine and the constant grunt and squeal of their charges. Swineherds, as they were known, had one of the lowliest jobs in the medieval world, one that was often looked down upon by other villagers. The reason for this disdain was simple. Pigs were considered unclean animals, associated with filth and disease. They were often left to forage in the muddy streets of the village, rooting through garbage and waste for scraps of food. Swineherds were tasked with keeping the pigs out of trouble, driving them out to the forests each day to find acorns and other fodder. It was a thankless job, one that required a strong stomach and a certain degree of patience. Pigs were stubborn creatures, prone to wandering off and getting into mischief. A swineherd had to be constantly on guard, using a stick or a whip to keep the pigs in line and prevent them from trampling crops or invading gardens. But for all the challenges, there were some who found a certain joy in working with pigs. One such swineherd was a woman named Johanna, who had been tending to the pigs on her lord's estate for as long as anyone could remember. Johanna was a peculiar figure, with a wild mane of greying hair and a face weathered by years spent outdoors. She was known for her strange habit of talking to the pigs as if they were old friends, giving them names and even singing to them as she led them out to pasture. Some in the village whispered that Johanna was a witch, that her uncanny connection to the pigs was a sign of dark magic. They pointed to the fact that her charges always seemed to be the fattest and healthiest in the area, with shiny coats and plump bellies that fetched a good price at market. Surely, they muttered, this was evidence of some sort of sorcery. But Johanna paid no heed to the rumours. She knew that her success with the pigs was due to hard work and a deep understanding of their needs. She had learned from a young age how to spot signs of illness or distress in the animals, and she knew just what to feed them to keep them healthy and strong. Despite her dedication, however, Johanna's life was far from easy. Swineherds were among the poorest of the peasants, often living hand-to-mouth on the meagre wages they earned. Johanna's hut was a ramshackle affair, with a leaky roof and drafty walls that did little to keep out the cold. She subsisted on a diet of bread and porridge, with the occasional scrap of meat from a slaughtered pig as a rare treat. But Johanna found solace in her work, in the simple pleasure of watching her pigs root and play in the forest. She knew that her efforts were vital to the survival of the village. Without the meat and lard provided by the pigs, many would go hungry during the long winter months, and so she persevered, day after day, year after year, tending to her charges with a dedication that bordered on the devotional. As the years went by, the rumours about Johanna's supposed witchcraft grew more insistent. Some claimed to have seen her dancing naked in the moonlight, surrounded by her pigs. Others whispered that she could transform into a pig herself, roaming the forest at night in search of unsuspecting prey. The lord of the manor, a superstitious man, began to grow uneasy with Johanna's presence on his land. One day, a group of villagers confronted Johanna as she was driving her pigs back to the manor. They accused her of using black magic to blight their crops and steal their children, demanding that she be tried as a witch. Johanna, tired and weathered from a long day in the fields, simply smiled and shook her head. "You fools," she said, her voice crackling with age and wisdom. "I am no witch, just a simple swineherd who knows her trade. My magic is nothing more than hard work and a love for these creatures." The villagers, taken aback by Johanna's calm demeanour, began to mutter amongst themselves. Some even looked ashamed of their accusations, recognising the truth in the old woman's words. In the end, they let her pass, watching as she disappeared into the forest with her pigs trailing behind her. Johanna continued to tend to her pigs for many years after that, until her body finally gave out and she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The village mourned her loss, recognising too late the value of her tireless work. They buried her at the edge of the forest, where her beloved pigs could root and play around her grave. And so, the legend of Johanna the swineherd passed into village lore, a reminder of the quiet dignity and perseverance of even the lowliest of peasants. Her story was told around hearth fires and over pints of ale, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who toiled in the fields and the forests, keeping the world fed and the wheels of society turning. As the sun rose over the village once more, casting a warm glow over the thatched roofs and muddy streets, the peasants emerged from their huts to begin another day of labour. The shepherds guided their flocks out to pasture, the swineherds drove their pigs to the forests, and the ploughmen hitched their oxen to the heavy wooden ploughs that would turn the earth and prepare it for planting. Among those setting out for the fields that morning was a young man named William. William was a ploughman like his father and grandfather before him, and he took great pride in his work. He knew that the success of the harvest depended on the skill and strength of men like him, who could guide the plough straight and true through the rich, dark soil. But William was not content with his lot in life. He had always been a dreamer, with a keen mind and a curiosity about the world beyond the village. As a child, he had learned to read and write from the local priest. sneaking away from his chores to pore over the few precious books in the church library. He had read tales of great heroes and far-off lands, of kings and queens and knights in shining armor. Now, as he walked behind his plough, feeling the sun on his back and the sweat trickling down his brow, William's mind wandered to those stories once more. He imagined himself as a knight, riding off to battle on a noble steed, his armor glinting in the sunlight. Or perhaps a scholar, like the wise men he had read about, who spent their days studying the mysteries of the universe in grand libraries and universities. But William knew that such dreams were foolish for a man of his station. He was a ploughman, bound to the land and to the will of his lord. His days would be spent in toil and his nights in exhaustion, with little hope of escape or advancement. And yet, something within him refused to accept this fate. He felt a stirring in his soul, a yearning for something more than the narrow confines of his village and his duties. As he guided the plough through the field, William's mind turned to the tales he had heard of a great poet, a man named Piers Ploughmen. Piers was a ploughman himself, but he had somehow found the words to capture the joys and sorrows of the peasant life in verse. His poems spoke of the beauty of the changing seasons, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, and the injustices of a world that treated the poor with disdain. William had never read Piers's poems himself, but he had heard snatches of them recited by travelling minstrels and learned men passing through the village. He marvelled at the idea that a simple ploughman could create something so beautiful and profound, something that could touch the hearts of people from all walks of life. In that moment, as the sun beat down on his back and the earth crumbled beneath his feet, William made a decision. He would learn to write like Piers Ploughmen, to capture the essence of his life and the lives of those around him in words that would endure long after he was gone. He would find a way to tell the stories of the peasants, to give voice to their struggles and their triumphs. It would not be easy, he knew. He would have to steal moments away from his work to practice his letters in the dirt with a stick or scratch them onto scraps of parchment by candlelight. He would have to face the scorn and derision of those who saw writing as a frivolous pursuit, unfit for a man of his station. But William was determined. He had tasted the power of words, and he would not let that power slip away. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, William continued to work the land, his body growing lean and strong from the endless cycle of ploughing and sowing, reaping and threshing. But in the moments between, he would pull out his precious scraps of parchment and his crude quill, and he would write. At first, his words were clumsy and halting, his hand unsteady, and his spelling erratic. But as he practiced, his skill grew. He learned to capture the rhythms of speech, the cadences of the seasons, the joys and sorrows of the peasant life. He wrote of the backbreaking labour of the fields, the simple pleasures of a hearty meal and a warm fire, the fear of famine and disease that haunted every peasant's dreams. And as he wrote, William began to feel a sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope in a world that had always seemed so bleak and unyielding. He knew that his words might never be read by anyone beyond his village, that they might crumble to dust along with his bones. But still, he wrote, pouring his heart and soul onto the page, giving voice to the voiceless and the forgotten. Years passed, and William grew old and grey, his hands gnarled from the plough, and his eyes dim from the strain of writing by flickering candlelight. But still he wrote, filling every spare scrap of parchment with his verses and his stories, and when he finally lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his children and his grandchildren, he smiled up at them with a sense of peace and fulfillment. "I have lived a peasant's life," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy, "but I have also lived a poet's life, and in the end, that is all that matters." With those words, William closed his eyes for the last time, his life's work complete. And though his name would never be remembered in the annals of history, his words would live on, a testament to the enduring spirit of the peasants who toiled in the fields and dreamed of a better world. As the news of William's death spread through the village, the peasants gathered to mourn the loss of one of their own. They may not have understood the value of his writing, may not have even known that he had been scribbling away in the moments between his labours, but they knew that he had been a good man, a hard worker, and a kind soul. They buried him in the churchyard, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross, and as they stood around the freshly turned earth, the priest spoke words of comfort and solace, reminding them that even the humblest of lives could have meaning and purpose in the eyes of God. But there was one among the mourners who saw more in William's life than just a pious peasant. It was the young priest's assistant, a man named Thomas, who had been tasked with sorting through William's meagre possessions after his death. And there, amidst the worn tools and patched clothing, he had found a small, leather-bound book filled with page after page of William's writing. As Thomas read through the book, his eyes widening with each passing verse, he felt a growing sense of excitement and wonder. Here was a treasure trove of peasant wisdom and insight, a window into a world that was so often overlooked and dismissed by the learned and the powerful. Here was proof that even the lowliest among them could have something valuable to say, something that could change the way people thought and felt about the world around them. Thomas knew that he could not let William's work be forgotten. He resolved to take the book to the monastery where he had been trained, to show it to the scholars and the scribes who spent their days preserving the wisdom of the ancients. He would tell them of William the ploughmen, the peasant poet who had captured the essence of his life and his times in simple, heartfelt verses. And so, with the book tucked safely in his satchel, Thomas set off on the long journey to the monastery, his heart full of hope and purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that he would face many challenges and obstacles along the way. But he also knew that he was carrying something precious, something that had the power to change lives and inspire generations to come. As he walked, Thomas thought of William, of the quiet strength and dignity he had shown in the face of a hard and unforgiving world. And he thought of all the other peasants like him, the men and women who toiled in the fields and the forests, the shepherds and the swineherds, the ploughmen and the threshers. They may have been invisible to the eyes of the powerful, but they were the backbone of the world, the ones who kept the wheels of society turning with their sweat and their blood. And with each step, Thomas felt a growing sense of pride and purpose. He may have been just a lowly priest's assistant, as the sun sinks slowly behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The weary peasants make their way back to the village. Their aching muscles and weathered hands bear testament to the long, hard day of labour behind them. The air is filled with the rich aroma of wood smoke drifting from the humble thatch-roofed cottages, a sign that the women have been busy preparing the evening meal. In one small hut, a man named John Pottock stirs a bubbling pot of pottage over the crackling fire. John is the village potter, a skilled craftsman who shapes the rough clay into sturdy vessels for storing and cooking food. It's a respectable trade, passed down from father to son, but the work is grueling. The heat from the kiln leaves his face permanently reddened and his hands rough and calloused. As John ladles the steaming pottage into crude bowls, his wife Agnes sets out a loaf of dense, dark bread. It's a meagre meal, but a welcome one after a day spent bent over the potter's wheel. Their children, 2 small boys and a girl, eagerly gather around the rough-hewn table, grateful for the simple fare. Across the village, a hunched figure shuffles towards his hovel, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. This is old Thomas, the oldest inhabitant of the village. His once strong body is now bent and twisted with age and a lifetime of hard labour. In his youth, Thomas was a falconer, training hawks and falcons for the lords to use in hunting. It was a position of some prestige, but a lonely one. The falconer often spent long hours in the fields and forests, far from human companionship. As Thomas settles onto his straw pallet, his mind drifts back to those days. The piercing cry of a falcon, the rush of wings, the thrill of the hunt. They were hard years, but good ones. He thinks of the young man he once was, filled with hope and dreams of a better life. Dreams that never came to fruition, ground down by the relentless cycle of toil and poverty. In another part of the village, a woman kneels by a small stream, scrubbing clothes on a washboard. This is Martha, the village midwife and healer. Hers is a position of great responsibility, assisting with births and tending to the sick and injured. But it is also a precarious one. If a birth goes badly or a patient dies, the midwife is often the first to be blamed, sometimes even accused of witchcraft. Martha's hands are red and chapped from the constant washing, and her back aches from bending over, but she knows her work is vital. Without her skills, many more mothers and infants would be lost. As she hangs the wet garments on a line to dry, Martha murmurs a quiet prayer for the health and safety of her village. As darkness falls, the peasants gather in small groups, huddled around flickering rushlight candles. They share stories and songs, seeking comfort in the fellowship of their neighbors. The old tales are told again, legends of brave knights and fair maidens, of mischievous sprites and wise old crones. For a few precious hours, the hardships of their lives are forgotten, lost in the magic of the storyteller's words. But all too soon, the candles gutter out and the villagers disperse to their beds, knowing that dawn will come all too early. They sleep deeply, exhausted from the day's labours, their dreams haunted by the never-ending cycle of work that is a peasant's lot. And yet, even in the midst of this hard life, there are moments of joy and beauty. The laughter of children playing in the sun-dappled fields, the sweet taste of a ripe berry, warm from the summer sun, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a challenging task accomplished through skill and perseverance. These are the small treasures that make life worth living, that give the peasants the strength to face another day. For despite the hardships, they are a resilient people, their spirits not easily broken. They find hope in the turning of the seasons, in the unshakable belief that better days lie ahead. And so they endure, these simple folk, tilling the land and tending the beasts, their lives woven inextricably into the rich tapestry of the medieval world. As the night deepens and the village settles into slumber, we are reminded of the countless generations of peasants who came before, the men and women whose toil and struggle laid the foundations for the world we know today. Theirs was a hard life, a life of unrelenting labour and scant reward, but it was also a life of great dignity and quiet heroism. In the grand sweep of history, their names may be forgotten, their stories lost to time, but their legacy endures, etched into the very soil they tilled, the stones they laid, the crafts they practiced. They were the backbone of medieval society, the unsung heroes who kept the wheels of civilization turning through the darkest of times. So let us remember them, these humble peasants, as we drift off to sleep in our own comfortable beds. Let us honour their strength and their sacrifice, and cherish the freedoms and comforts we enjoy today. For in doing so, we keep their memory alive, a flicker of light against the darkness of the ages. As the first rooster begins to crow, heralding the dawn of a new day, the village stirs to life once more. The cycle begins anew, the planting and the reaping, the birthing and the dying, the endless round of the seasons. And through it all, the peasants endure, their lives a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human soul. As the swineherd drives his pigs back to their pen, the sun dips lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the Lord's estate. The gong farmer, a man named John, is just beginning his unenviable task for the day. He collects his tools, a long-handled ladle, a bucket, and a simple cloth mask to cover his nose and mouth. With a heavy sigh, he makes his way to the first of the estate's cesspits. The stench hits him like a physical blow as he removes the cover. John tries to breathe through his mouth as he lowers his ladle into the dark, viscous depths. He scoops the muck into his bucket, gagging at the overpowering odor of human waste and decay. It's a vile job, but someone has to do it. After all, even lords and ladies must heed the call of nature. John knows he's fortunate to have steady work, even if it is loathsome. He thinks of his friend Thomas, one of the ditch diggers, who spends his days knee-deep in mud, excavating trenches and drainage channels. It's backbreaking labour, made all the worse by the clouds of biting flies that swarm around the workers as they toil under the hot sun. As John slogs from cesspit to cesspit, he dreams of a better life, perhaps as a skilled craftsman like the blacksmith or the thatcher. But such trades are often passed down from father to son, and John's father was a gong farmer, as was his father before him. It seems his fate is sealed, much like the noxious contents of his bucket. Nearby, the steady thunk of an axe rings out as the woodcutter fells a tree. It's dangerous work, with the ever-present risk of being crushed by a falling trunk or losing a limb to an errant swing of the axe. The woodcutter's arms ache with fatigue, but he cannot rest. The estate's fireplaces and ovens have a constant hunger for wood, and it's his job to feed them. The woodcutter's thoughts drift to the wild tales he's heard of the charcoal burners who live deep in the forest. They're a strange, solitary breed, spending months at a time tending their smouldering mounds of wood. Some say they have secret knowledge of the old ways, of pagan rites and forest spirits. Others whisper that they're outcasts, driven to the margins of society by misdeeds or madness. As the woodcutter pauses to wipe the sweat from his brow, he catches sight of a procession winding its way towards the village churchyard. At its head is the stocky figure of Tom Dunn, the gravedigger. He's a grim, taciturn man, well suited to his macabre trade. There's no shortage of work for Tom, what with the frequent outbreaks of disease, the harsh winters, and the occasional violence between feuding lords. Some of the village women whisper that Tom is cursed, that his proximity to death has tainted his soul. They say he talks to the corpses he buries, that he pries gold teeth and rings from their stiffening jaws. There are even rumours that he's been seen walking the churchyard at night, his lantern casting eerie shadows among the gravestones. But Tom pays no heed to such talk. He's too busy with the endless cycle of digging and filling, of laying the dead to rest in the cold, dark earth. He takes a grim sort of pride in his work, knowing that he's the last person to handle the earthly remains of the departed. As the gravedigger's procession fades into the distance, John the gong farmer finally finishes his nauseating rounds. He sets down his bucket and heads towards the small hut he calls home. His wife Agnes is stirring a pot of thin gruel over the fire. She wrinkles her nose as John steps inside, the stench of the cesspits clinging to his clothes and skin. John splashes some precious water from a basin onto his face and hands, trying to rinse away the worst of the filth. He knows he should be grateful for his lot in life. After all, he has a roof over his head and food in his belly, meagre though it may be. But sometimes he dreams of a world where a man's worth isn't measured by the sweat on his brow or the calluses on his hands. He thinks of the stories he's heard of the great cities, where scholars debate in grand halls and merchants grow fat on the profits of their trade. He wonders what it would be like to have the freedom to choose his own path, to be more than just a cog in the feudal machine. But such thoughts are dangerous for a mere peasant. John knows that his place is here, toiling on the Lord's estate from cradle to grave. It's the way things have always been, and the way they always will be. As John settles down to his meagre supper, he thinks of the day ahead, of the cesspits that will need emptying, the fields that will need ploughing, the livestock that will need tending. It's a never-ending cycle of sweat and struggle, but it's the only life he knows. And yet, even in the midst of this bleak existence, there are moments of joy and connection. The laughter of children playing in the village square, the warmth of Agnes's smile, the simple pleasure of a full belly and a fire on a cold night. These are the things that keep John going, that give him the strength to face another day of toil and hardship. They're small comforts, but in a world where life is so often nasty, brutish, and short, they're enough to sustain him. As the last light fades from the sky and the stars begin to glimmer overhead, John closes his eyes and lets the weariness overtake him. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more filth, more sweat, more aching muscles and blistered hands. But for now, he can rest and dream of a world beyond the confines of his humble existence. The village settles into its nightly rhythm. The low murmur of families gathered around hearths, the occasional bleat of a goat or whinny of a horse, the distant hoot of an owl in the woods. The peasants slumber, their bodies and minds spent from the day's labours. But even in sleep, they're not entirely free. Their dreams are haunted by the spectre of hunger, of sickness, of the capricious whims of their feudal lords. They twitch and mutter, their faces gripped tight with fear or pain or despair. And yet, amidst the darkness, there are flickers of hope. The dream of a better life, of a world where a person's destiny isn't dictated by the circumstances of their birth. It's a fragile flame, constantly threatened by the harsh winds of reality, but it endures nonetheless. For the peasants know deep in their weary bones that change is coming. They can feel it in the restlessness that stirs in their hearts, in the whispered conversations of rebellion and revolt that drift through the village like smoke. One day their voices will rise in a mighty chorus, demanding justice and freedom. One day the shackles of the old order will be cast aside, and a new world will be born. But for now, they sleep. They rest their battered bodies and brace themselves for the struggles of the day to come. And they keep the flicker of hope alive in their dreams, knowing that even the darkest night must eventually give way to dawn. As the first rooster crows and the peasants stir from their restless slumber, the cycle begins anew. They rise with aching backs and calloused hands, ready to face another day of endless toil. Some tend to the animals, others head to the fields, their stoic faces hiding the weariness within. John the Gong farmer picks up his dreaded bucket, steeling himself for the stench that awaits. Thomas the ditch digger grabs his shovel, his mind already calculating the hours until he can rest. Agnes stokes the fire and begins preparing the day's meagre meals, her thoughts on her children's empty bellies. In the distance, the Lord's manor looms, a symbol of wealth and power, so far removed from the peasants' daily struggle for survival. They know their place in this feudal hierarchy, forever beholden to the whims and dictates of their supposed betters. But the seeds of change have been planted, and they're beginning to take root in the most unexpected places. A grizzled veteran of the 100 Years' War returning to his village with stories of a wider world. A travelling monk preaching radical notions of equality under God. A restless young peasant daring to dream of a life beyond the confines of his station. These ideas spread like wildfire, passing from one peasant to another in furtive whispers and knowing glances. They speak of a world turned upside down, of lords and ladies brought low and common folk raised high. They speak of ancient rights and freedoms, long suppressed but never forgotten. And so, even as they go about their backbreaking labours, the peasants nurture this spark of rebellion in their hearts. They know the road ahead will be long and fraught with peril. They know that many will suffer and die in the struggle to come. But they also know that they can no longer abide the yoke of servitude, the grinding poverty and endless indignities of their lot. They've tasted the promise of a better life, and they're willing to fight for it, come what may. So they toil on, their bodies bent but their spirits unbroken. They endure the hardships of the present, sustained by the dream of a brighter future. And they wait for the moment when the scales will finally tip, when the fury of the oppressed will boil over and sweep away the old order like chaff in the wind. This is the untold story of the medieval peasantry. Not just a litany of their labours and hardships, but a testament to their resilience, their tenacity, their unquenchable thirst for justice. It's a story that echoes across the centuries, reminding us of the indomitable spirit that lies at the heart of every struggle for freedom and dignity. And so, as we gaze back through the mists of time, let us remember these humble folk, the gong farmers and ditch diggers, the woodcutters and swineherds. Let us honour their sacrifices and their triumphs, their dreams and their defiance, for in the end, it was their sweat and blood that laid the foundation for the world we know today. It was their unsung heroism that paved the way for the rights and liberties we now take for granted. Their names may have been lost to history, but their legacy endures. And as long as there are those who strive for a better world, their story will never be forgotten. The sun rises higher in the sky, casting its light over the medieval village. The peasants labour on, their lives a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of adversity. It's a story as old as civilization itself, and one that will continue to be written as long as there are those who dream of a brighter tomorrow. But for now, we leave them to their toil, secure in the knowledge that their struggles and their triumphs will echo through the ages. Rest well, weary listener, and may the quiet courage of these medieval peasants be a balm and an inspiration, even in the darkest of times. As the sun set over the medieval village, casting a warm golden glow across the thatched roofs and muddy lanes, the weary peasants trudged home after another long day of backbreaking labour. Their hands were calloused and their faces weathered from countless hours toiling in the fields, tending to livestock and serving their feudal lords. Despite the hardships they endured, there was a quiet dignity in their simple way of life, a strength and resilience forged through adversity. For most peasants, there was little hope of ever escaping the crushing poverty and servitude that defined their existence. They were bound to the land, their fates intertwined with the fortunes of their noble masters. From the moment they were born until their dying breaths, they were destined to work the soil, raise crops and animals, and fulfill their duties with unquestioning obedience. But even amidst the daily grind of feudal life, there were occasional moments of reprieve and joy. The church feast days were eagerly anticipated events when work ceased and the village came together to celebrate their faith and community. Harvest time, too, brought a sense of satisfaction and camaraderie as neighbours worked side by side to bring in the ripened grain before winter set in. And then there were the travelling minstrels who sometimes passed through the village, bringing with them songs, stories and news from distant lands. For a few precious hours, the peasants could forget their troubles and lose themselves in tales of brave knights, fair maidens, and mystical creatures. It was a rare glimpse of a world beyond their own narrow confines. Yet despite these fleeting pleasures, the life of a medieval peasant was one of unrelenting hardship and struggle. They were at the mercy of the elements, vulnerable to droughts, floods, and blights that could destroy their crops and bring famine in their wake. They lived in constant fear of disease, with no understanding of how to prevent or treat the maladies that stalked their communities. And always, there was the spectre of war, of marauding armies that could lay waste to their fields and homes, leaving them destitute and starving. Perhaps it was no wonder, then, that the dream of freedom and a better life smouldered in the hearts of many peasants. Though they risked severe punishment or even death for defying their masters, there were those who dared to rebel against the oppressive feudal system. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands of commoners rise up against the nobility, demanding an end to serfdom and unfair taxation. Though the uprising was ultimately crushed, it sent shockwaves through medieval society and sowed the seeds of change that would slowly take root in the centuries to come. As night fell and the peasants settled into their humble abodes to rest their aching bodies before another day of toil began, one could only imagine the dreams that drifted through their minds. Dreams of a life unshackled from the bonds of servitude, of a world where they were masters of their own destinies. They may have been the lowliest members of medieval society, but in their hearts burned a fierce and unquenchable spirit. A spirit that would endure through the ages and pave the way for the freedoms we enjoy today. So let us pause and reflect on the lives of these medieval peasants, the common folk whose hard labour and quiet strength built the very foundations of the modern world. Though their names may be lost to history, their legacy lives on in the values of perseverance, resilience, and hope that they embodied. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry their stories with us and honour the sacrifices they made. For in remembering and learning from the past, we may just find the wisdom and courage to face the challenges of our own time. The peat diggers were another group of medieval peasants who toiled in obscurity, carrying out backbreaking work that was vital to the functioning of their communities. In a time before coal or gas, peat was a crucial source of fuel for heating homes and cooking food. But harvesting this dense, spongy material from boggy wetlands was no easy task. Peat diggers would venture out into the misty moors and fens, armed with sharp, spade-like tools called sleans. With practiced movements, they would cut rectangular blocks of peat from the waterlogged earth, each one about the size of a brick. It was grueling, repetitive labour that left their hands blistered and their muscles aching. The heavy waterlogged peat had to be lifted out of the bog and stacked carefully to dry, a process that could take weeks or even months. Despite the challenges of their work, some peat diggers managed to find solace and even beauty in their solitary pursuits. One such figure was Meg, a peat wife who lived in the lowlands of Scotland during the 14th century. Little is known about Meg's life, but fragments of her poetry have survived, offering a rare glimpse into the mind and heart of a medieval peasant woman. In her verses, Meg wrote of the quiet majesty of the moors, the changing colours of the seasons, and the simple joys of a life lived in harmony with nature. She found inspiration in the rugged landscape that surrounded her, from the purple heather that bloomed in the summer to the ghostly wisps of fog that drifted over the bogs in the early morning hours. But Meg's poetry also hinted at the hardships and sorrows of her existence. She wrote of the aching loneliness of long days spent in the peat fields, far from the companionship of her fellow villagers. She mourned the loss of loved ones taken too soon by disease or accident, and grappled with the bitter injustice of a world that seemed to value the wealthy and powerful over the humble and hard-working. Despite the challenges she faced, Meg's words reveal a woman of deep sensitivity and resilience, one who found beauty and meaning in even the most difficult of circumstances. Her poetry stands as a testament to the enduring human spirit, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for hope and creativity to flourish. As we contemplate the life of Meg the peat wife and the countless other peasants who laboured in obscurity during the Middle Ages, we are reminded of the quiet strength and dignity of the common people. Though they may have been overlooked or dismissed by their social superiors, they played an essential role in shaping the course of history, laying the foundations for the world we know today. So let us remember and honour the peat diggers, the lime burners, the shepherds, and the ploughmen, all the humble labourers who toiled in the fields and villages of medieval Europe. Their stories may be largely lost to time, but their legacy lives on in the values of hard work, perseverance, and hope that they embodied. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry their memory with us and be inspired by their example to face the challenges of our own lives with courage and grace. The lives of medieval peasants were not solely defined by their work, of course. Despite the grinding poverty and social constraints they faced, these men and women still found ways to carve out moments of joy, community, and self-expression in their daily existence. One of the most eagerly anticipated respites from the daily grind were the church feast days that punctuated the medieval calendar. On these holy days, work was forbidden, and the entire village would come together to celebrate their faith and enjoy a much-needed break from their labours. The air would be filled with the sounds of ringing church bells, cheerful music, and laughter as families and neighbours gathered to feast, dance, and socialise. For many peasants, these festive occasions were a rare opportunity to indulge in a bit of revelry and excess. Tables would groan under the weight of hearty dishes like roasted meats, savoury pies, and fresh-baked bread, washed down with copious amounts of ale or mead. Children would play boisterous games while their elders gossiped, traded stories, and perhaps even engaged in a bit of good-natured rivalry with folks from neighbouring villages. But church feast days weren't just about food and fun. They also served an important social and spiritual function, reinforcing the bonds of community and shared belief that helped peasants weather the hardships of their lives. In a world where most people rarely travelled beyond their own village, these gatherings were a chance to connect with the wider world, to feel part of something greater than themselves. Similarly, the harvest season was a time of great significance for medieval peasants, marking the culmination of months of hard work and anxiety. As the crops ripened in the fields, the entire community would mobilize to bring in the precious bounty before the weather turned. Men, women, and children would work side by side from dawn to dusk, cutting grain with sickles, bundling it into sheaves, and hauling it to the threshing floor. It was exhausting, all-consuming labor, but it was also imbued with a sense of purpose and camaraderie. The success of the harvest could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a season of hunger and hardship, so everyone pitched in to ensure that not a single stalk was wasted. And when the last sheaf was brought in, the village would erupt in celebration, with feasting, dancing, and songs of thanksgiving. For a few brief, shining moments, the divisions of class and status would fade away, and everyone from the lowliest serf to the local lord would come together in a spirit of shared achievement and relief. It was a reminder that, despite the many challenges and injustices of medieval life, there was still much to be grateful for. Of course, not all of the joys of peasant life were communal in nature. Even in the midst of their daily labours, individuals found ways to express their creativity and find moments of solitary pleasure. Many peasants were skilled craftsmen, creating beautiful objects like pottery, textiles, and ironwork in their spare time. Others found solace in music, poetry, or storytelling, using these art forms to give voice to their hopes, fears, and dreams. And then there were the small, everyday moments of beauty and wonder that punctuated even the bleakest of days. The sight of a rainbow arcing across a stormy sky, the sound of a nightingale's song drifting through the twilight, the feel of a cool breeze on a hot summer afternoon. These were the simple, ephemeral pleasures that reminded peasants of the magic and mystery of the natural world, even in the midst of their struggles. As we reflect on the lives of medieval peasants, it's easy to focus on the hardships and injustices they faced. But it's important to remember that these men and women were more than just the sum of their labours and their suffering. They were individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and moments of joy. however fleeting or hard-won. By striving to understand and appreciate the fullness of their experiences, we can gain a deeper sense of empathy and connection with those who came before us. We can find inspiration in their resilience, their creativity, and their ability to find beauty and meaning in even the most challenging of circumstances. And in doing so, we can perhaps learn to approach our own lives with a greater sense of perspective, gratitude, and grace. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold space in our hearts for the peasants of the Middle Ages and for all those throughout history whose stories have been lost or overlooked. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys. And let us carry forward their legacy of perseverance, community, and hope as we face the challenges and opportunities of our own time. For in remembering and learning from the past, we may just find the wisdom and courage to build a brighter, more compassionate future for all. As the sun rose over the thatched roofs and smoke curled from the chimneys, the village began to stir. Roosters crowed their dawn chorus as weary peasants emerged from their humble huts to face another day of ceaseless toil. Life as a medieval peasant was a brutal existence of grinding poverty and backbreaking labor from sunup to sundown. Most were born into serfdom, bound to the land they worked and subservient to the whims of their feudal lords. They eked out a meager subsistence, toiling in the fields and forests, tending to livestock, and performing the menial tasks that kept the manor running. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe was a rigid hierarchy with the king and nobility at the top and the lowly peasantry at the bottom. Though some freemen and yeoman farmers enjoyed a measure of independence, the vast majority were serfs who owed labour services and a share of their harvest to their lord in exchange for a small plot of land. They were not slaves in the strictest sense, for they could not be bought and sold like chattel, but they were far from free. A typical peasant family dwelled in a tiny 1 or 2 room hut, its walls woven from branches and its roof thatched with straw. If they were fortunate, they might have a packed dirt floor strewn with rushes and a smoky hearth for warmth and cooking. But many made do with even less. Their furnishings were simple and sparse, perhaps a straw pallet for a bed, a wooden chest or two, a rickety table and stools, a few clay pots, wooden bowls and spoons, and a precious knife or two rounded out their meagre possessions. Privacy was non-existent in these close confines shared with livestock. Diet was likewise sparse and monotonous, consisting mostly of coarse bread, pottage, a thin vegetable soup, and the occasional bit of salt pork or fish for the slightly better off. The poorest subsisted on little more than gruel and whatever vegetables they could grow. Hunger was a constant spectre, especially during lean winters or times of famine. A peasant's day began before dawn, rising from a fitful sleep to tend to the animals. Cows needed to be milked, chickens fed, pigs slopped. Shepherds drove their flocks out to pasture, watching warily for wolves. Goat herds scaled craggy hills and cliffsides with their nimble chargers in search of forage. Come daylight, most peasants headed to the fields that stretched beyond the village confines. Here, endless hours were spent in grinding, repetitive labour, planting and harvesting the wheat, rye, barley, oats, peas and beans that sustained the populace. It was a hard-scrabble existence at the mercy of the elements, pests, and the success of the harvest. Hunched over in the morning chill, the ploughman guided his lumbering oxen team as they strained against the heavy wooden plough. Foot by foot, furrow by furrow, he tilled the soil in the time-honoured way, unchanged for centuries. It was exhausting work that left him bone-weary and aching at day's end. Following in his wake came the sowers, scattering precious seed carefully saved from the previous harvest. With a deft flick of the wrist, they cast the grain upon the fertile earth, knowing that their family's survival depended on their skill and judgment. Would birds steal the seed? Would too much rain drown the tender shoots? Only time would tell. When the wheat ripened to a tawny gold beneath the summer sun, the reapers assembled, armed with their curved sickles. Bent double, they methodically scythed the stalks, gathering them into sheaves to be collected and threshed. It was a race against time and weather to complete the harvest before autumn storms could ruin the crop. Men, women, and children all had vital roles to play, and none were idle. When not required in the fields, peasant women cared for the young, the elderly, and the sick, kept the fire going, fetched water, baked bread, brewed weak ale, and if time allowed, spun wool and wove coarse cloth to make clothing. Even children as young as 5 contributed to the household by gathering eggs, picking vegetables, herding geese, or scaring birds from the crops. While the vast majority of peasants toiled in anonymity, their lives unrecorded, a few remarkable individuals defied the odds to leave their mark on history. One such person was William Langland, born around 1330 in the English Midlands to a poor but pious farming family. Though details of his early life are scarce, as a bright lad of humble birth, Langland's options were limited. Like countless others, he seemed destined for a life of menial drudgery. But fate and the local clergy intervened. Impressed by his quick mind and devotion, the parish priest took an interest in the youth, teaching him to read and write. In an era when literacy was a rarity among the lower classes, this gift of education would change the course of Langland's life. With his new skills, Langland was able to join the ranks of the minor clergy, likely starting as a lowly parish clerk before working his way up to become a chantry priest. It was a respectable position that offered a measure of status and security, if not great wealth. But for all his learning, Langland never forgot his roots. He remained deeply troubled by the plight of the common folk and the injustices he witnessed daily. Serfdom, poverty, disease, corruption in the church, and the capricious cruelty of the nobility. These weighed heavy on his soul. Langland channeled his compassion and outrage into his life's great work, a sprawling, allegorical poem called Piers Ploughmen, or Peter the Ploughman. Rich in satire and social commentary, it chronicles the dream-world adventures of a humble ploughman named Piers in his quest for truth and understanding. Through his namesake, Langland gave voice to the voiceless peasantry, laying bare their hardships and humanity. With biting wit, he skewered the hypocrisy of the clergy and the avarice of the aristocracy, calling for a return to Christian charity and the dignity of honest labour. Though written in the Middle English vernacular, rather than the Latin of the learned class, Piers Ploughmen struck a chord, circulating widely and inspiring calls for reform. Langland's empathy and insight elevated the struggles of the common man to the level of literature and influenced writers for generations to come. In a life that could have been unremarkable, William Langland made the choice to be a witness and a voice for his fellow peasants. His words gave them a measure of immortality they never could have imagined as they trudged home each dusk on aching feet, the soil still beneath their nails, to sleep and rise again to toil anew. For those with a passion for animals over crops, being a shepherd or goat herd offered a degree of independence and mobility, if not comfort. Entrusted with the Lord's valuable livestock, they spent their days roaming the hillsides and pastures, vigilantly guarding their woolly charges from predators and thieves. It was a lonely, rugged existence exposed to the elements. Shepherds thought nothing of bedding down with their faithful dogs beneath the stars, wrapped only in a rough woolen cloak for warmth. They were a resourceful breed, as adept at wielding a sling to fend off wolves as they were at playing a cheerful tune on a pipe during the long, slow hours of grazing. But even this pastoral idyll could be shattered by the cruel twists of fate, as the strange and sorry tale of Johanna the goose girl shows. Johanna was a simple maid, content in her humble lot tending the geese for the wealthy Franklin family on the outskirts of the village. With her gaggle of noisy, beady-eyed birds, she would wander the commons and fens, a slip of a girl, dwarfed by her squawking, flapping charges. The villagers would smile to see her go by, trailed by a great white and grey cloud of honking geese oblivious to all but the next choice morsel. Johanna had a way with the fowl, a knack for keeping them in line with softly spoken words and the occasional stern wave of her crook. She took pride in delivering them plump and pristine for the Franklin's table on high feast days and holidays. But beneath her sunny demeanour, Johanna harboured a secret passion. Whenever she could steal a moment away from her geese, she would hasten to the hedgerows and forest edges to gather herbs, feverfew, tansy, pennyroyal, wolfsbane. With patient experimentation, she taught herself the arts of healing and remedy, tending to sick villagers and birthing mothers with her potions and poultices. Word of her gift spread, and soon people from all over the district were seeking out the goose girl for her cures and midwifery skills. To the desperate and ailing, Johanna was an angel of mercy, but to others, especially those in power, an unlearned peasant girl meddling in such matters could only be one thing: a witch. Accused by envious rivals and fearful clerics, Johanna was arrested and hauled before the court. In vain, she protested her innocence, claiming she was but a simple goose girl who had only ever sought to help those in need. But the forces arrayed against her were implacable. Witnesses came forth to swear they had seen her cavorting with imps and devils in the moonlight, gathering strange herbs for her foul brews. Under threat of torture, poor Johanna broke down and confessed to all manner of outlandish crimes and congress with Satan. Her terrible fate was sealed. The sentence, burning at the stake, was handed down swiftly and without mercy. The pious villagers who had once sought her aid now jeered and cursed as she was led to the pyre, bewailing her betrayal and wicked ways. As the flames licked around her, Johanna's desperate screams pierced the air, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the honking of the geese set free to wander masterless. A pungent whiff of herb smoke tinged the inferno, lending a bitter irony to her demise. Thus perished Johanna, the goose girl, a victim of the ignorance and superstition of her age. Her crime, naught but compassion cloaked in the peasant arts of herb and healer. In a time when women, especially those of low birth, were so easily demonized, her fate was all too common. Not all jobs on the Lord's estate allowed for the small freedoms and open air enjoyed by the goose girls and shepherds. For those at the very bottom of the social order, only the most menial, unpleasant tasks would do. Chief among these was the reviled role of the gong farmer, a lowly serf charged with the unenviable task of cleaning out latrines, privies, and cesspits. Day after day, these wretched souls would wade knee-deep through the fetid muck, shoveling the waste into buckets to haul away and dispose of. The stench was unbearable, a noxious miasma of human excrement mingled with rotten food scraps, animal dung, and other vile effluvium. Even the hardiest soul would gag and heave, eyes streaming, as they tried to breathe through a rag tied across their face. But worse than the smell was the very real danger of disease. The gong farmers waded unprotected through a toxic soup, teeming with parasites and pathogens, at a time when concepts of hygiene and sanitation were utterly alien. It's little wonder so many fell victim to dysentery, cholera, and other horrific ailments. Their life expectancy was dismally short. It's telling that this critical but loathsome job was reserved for the lowest of the low in the feudal hierarchy. These were the expendables, the untouchables, their lives considered of little worth beyond the filthy function they provided. They were shunned by their fellow peasants and exist mostly as passing references in the chronicles of the time, faceless and forgotten. Slightly higher on the estate drudgery scale were the ditch diggers, tasked with the backbreaking work of draining land for farming, digging irrigation channels, and excavating defensive trenches for the Lord's fortifications. From dawn till dusk, they would hack at the stubborn sod, hurling shovelfuls of dirt until their hands blistered and their shoulders screamed. It was a Sisyphean effort, for as soon as one section was cleared, silted up or collapsed, they would have to start anew. The ditches were their domain, the standing water and sucking mud their constant companions. Mosquitoes, leeches, and venomous water snakes were an ever-present hazard, to say nothing of the risk of cave-ins and drowning. Many were the mothers' laments for sons who marched off to dig and never returned, their lungs choked with muck or their bodies broken beneath a ton of crumbling earth. It was a hard way to rest a living, an endless, brutal battle against nature fueled only by thin gruel and the overseer's lash. And then there were the woodcutters, those hardy souls who journeyed out each morn to the Lord's forests to hew and haul the great timbers that fed the ever-hungry fires of the manor and village. Theirs was a world of sap and sawdust, of flashing axes and ringing wedges, of straining sinews and crushing weights. To fell a full-grown oak or elm was no mean feat in an age before motorized saws and metal wedges. Armed only with hand-forged axes and primitive saws, the woodcutters would hack and chop for hours to bring down a single tree, scrambling clear with shouts of timber as the groaning giant finally succumbed. But that was only the beginning, for then came the Herculean task of delimbing, bucking, and splitting the behemoth into transportable pieces. Green wood is heavy and stubborn, fighting the blade at every turn. A man could exhaust himself wrestling a single log onto a mule cart, only to have to repeat the process a dozen times more. Accidents were common and horrific: crushed limbs, severed fingers, fatal blows from kickback and widowmakers. A falling tree is an awesome and unforgiving force, and the woodcutter who misjudged its lean or failed to plan his escape would pay the ultimate price. Many a village woman became a widow thanks to an errant bough or twitch of an axe. Yet for all its perils, the job of a woodcutter held a certain appeal and status among the peasantry. There was a rugged independence to it, a sense of skill and mastery far removed from the dull routines of the field and barnyard. In the eyes of some, the woodcutter embodied the wild, untamable spirit of the forest itself. So it was for Wat Tyler, a simple man who earned his daily bread hewing wood and laying thatch for the manor roofs. Born a serf with no prospects beyond a lifetime of servitude, he nevertheless dreamed of a better lot, of a world where a man might be master of his own fate. As he toiled amidst the timber and straw, Wat would compose stirring speeches in his head, railing against the injustices of the feudal order. He spoke of the right of every man to be free, to own land and keep the fruits of his labour, of an end to the arbitrary abuses and heavy taxes of the gentry, of the common folk rising up as one to throw off their shackles and claim their God-given dignity. At first, his words fell on deaf ears, for his fellow peasants were too cowed and beaten down to believe change was possible. The yoke of serfdom had been their bitter birthright for generations. Who were they to question their masters, or the natural order of things? But Wat would not be deterred. With the zeal of a prophet, he continued to preach his gospel of liberation, gathering a small but passionate band of followers. They met in secret, in forest glades and thatch huts, plotting and planning for the day when they would make their stand. That day came in the summer of 1381, when simmering discontent over a hated poll tax finally boiled over into open rebellion. Across England, peasants rose up in arms, torching manor houses and attacking tax collectors. It was the moment Wat had been waiting for. Emerging from the forests of Kent at the head of a motley army of serfs and labourers, Wat marched on London, his ranks swelling with each passing mile. The ragtag rebels struck fear into the heart of the establishment, their demands for an end to serfdom and feudal privilege a direct challenge to the entrenched power of the crown and church. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed that Wat and his followers would carry the day. They stormed the Tower of London, executed the hated chancellor and treasurer, and even won an audience with the boy king Richard II, who quailed before their might. But fate and treachery would conspire against them. During a heated parley at Smithfield, Wat was suddenly attacked and stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London. As he lay bleeding, the rebellion fell into disarray, and the king's men moved in for the kill. Wat Tyler, the visionary woodcutter and peasant's hero, would not live to see his dream of a more just social order come to pass. Captured and condemned as a traitor, he was hanged, drawn. As the sun sinks slowly over the thatched roofs of the village, the peasants make their weary way home after another long day of toil. The blacksmith, his face streaked with soot, banks the fires of his forge and stretches his aching muscles. The thatcher climbs down carefully from the roof he's been mending, bits of straw clinging to his clothes and hair. And in the shadows of the church graveyard, the hunched figure of the gravedigger plunges his shovel into the earth one last time before heading for home. These are the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages, the common folk, whose backbreaking labour kept the world turning. They may not have had the wealth and privilege of the nobles in their grand castles and manors, but they had something perhaps even more valuable: grit, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit that refused to be crushed by hardship. Take the story of Meg, the peat wife. Hers was a life of solitude and unceasing toil, spent knee-deep in the chilly, murky waters of the peat bog. Day after day, she would cut the heavy blocks of peat and stack them carefully to dry, her only companions the birds and the wind whistling through the reeds. It was a lonely, backbreaking existence, but Meg found beauty in it nonetheless. In the quiet moments between her labours, she would scribble poems on scraps of birch bark, odes to the vibrancy of the dragonflies dancing over the water, to the sweet scent of the wildflowers that speckled the boggy fields. Her verses spoke of the simple joys and sorrows of a peasant's life, and the deep connection she felt to the land that sustained her. Meg's story may be lost to history, but her spirit lives on in the countless other peasants who found small moments of grace and beauty amidst the drudgery of their lives. The shepherds who watched in wonder as the first tentative lambs of spring took their wobbling steps. The reaper who paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and marvel at the glint of the sun on the scythe's blade. The thatcher who took pride in a roof well mended, knowing it would keep a family safe and warm. And then there were the peasants who dared to dream of something more, the ones who refused to accept that a life of servitude was all there could be. Folk heroes like Wat Tyler, who rose from his humble beginnings as a roof tiler to lead the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a fierce, defiant stand against the oppression and injustice of the ruling class. Tyler's story began like so many other peasants' tales, with a life of grinding poverty and backbreaking work. As a boy, he learned the craft of roof tiling from his father, spending long hours lugging heavy bundles of clay tiles up ladders and across precarious rooftops. It was a difficult and dangerous trade, but Tyler took pride in his skills and his strength. But as he grew older, Tyler began to chafe against the rigid confines of the feudal system that kept peasants like him trapped in a cycle of poverty and subservience. He saw the way the nobles lorded their wealth and power over the common folk, crushing them under the weight of taxes and forced labour. And he saw the way the clergy, meant to be the moral conscience of society, more often than not sided with the wealthy and powerful over the downtrodden masses. Something kindled in Tyler's heart, a spark of righteous anger that would soon flare into the flames of rebellion. In 1381, when the crown imposed yet another crippling tax on the peasantry, Tyler had had enough. He rallied his fellow villagers, urging them to stand up and fight for their rights as free Englishmen. Word of the uprising spread like wildfire through the countryside, And soon, tens of thousands of peasants had joined the cause, marching on London to demand an end to serfdom and unfair taxation. With Tyler at their head, the rebels stormed the Tower of London, captured and executed the hated men who had oppressed them for so long, the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Treasurer. For one brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the peasants might actually triumph, as if the world they had always known might be remade into something new and better. But it was not to be. The young king, Richard II, threatened by the growing power of the rebels, lured Tyler into a trap and had him brutally executed, his head displayed on a pike as a warning to any who would dare defy the crown. The peasants' revolt was crushed, and the dream of a more just and equitable society retreated into the mists of history. But the spirit of defiance that Wat Tyler embodied would never be entirely extinguished. It lived on in the peasants who continued to toil and struggle, who found small moments of joy and meaning in their hard-scrabble lives, and who held fast to the hope that one day their children or their children's children might know a better world. As darkness falls over the medieval village, the last of the peasants shut their doors against the chill of the night. In the smoky dimness of their huts, they gather close around the meagre warmth of the hearth, telling stories of the day's labours and the dreams that keep them going. A mother soothes a fretful child with a lullaby about the heroic deeds of Johanna the goose girl. A grizzled old swineherd recounts the bawdy exploits of his youth to a rapt audience of young men. A peat cutter's wife recites one of Meg's poems, her voice soft and lilting in the flickering firelight. These are the tales that will sustain them through the long, hard years ahead, the tales of ordinary men and women who faced extraordinary hardships with courage, resilience, and grace. They may be forgotten by the history books and the chronicles of kings and queens, but they will live on in the hearts and minds of their descendants, the peasants who will continue to till the fields, raise the animals, and build the world anew with the sweat of their brows and the strength of their backs. And as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with the sights and sounds of that long ago world, we can take comfort in the knowledge that their legacy endures. In every farmer who coaxes life from the stubborn soil, in every labourer who takes pride in a job well done, in every soul who dares to stand up for what is right and just. There, the spirit of the medieval peasant lives on, unbroken and unvanquished, a testament to the unbreakable courage of the common man. So let us remember them, these humble heroes of history, the ploughmen and the shepherds, the gravediggers and the gong farmers, the peat wives and the goose girls. Let us honour their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys. And let us carry their stories with us as we face the challenges of our own time, drawing strength and inspiration from the knowledge that we are all the heirs of their unbreakable spirit. As the last embers of the hearth glow softly in the darkness, we close our eyes and let the gentle rhythms of the medieval world lull us into slumber. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft rustle of wind through the thatch, the creaking of timbers and the sighing of sleeping peasants, all these meld together into a soothing lullaby, a reminder of the deep and abiding connection we share with all those who came before us. And as we drift off into dreams, we can almost see them, the peasants of ages past, toiling and striving, loving and laughing, their faces lined with the joys and sorrows of a life well lived. They are with us still, these forgotten heroes, watching over us from the mists of time, reminding us always of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome, to endure, to dream. And so we sleep, cradled in the warmth of their memory, secure in the knowledge that no matter what trials may come, we will face them as they did, with courage, with compassion, and with an unshakable faith in the goodness that lies at the heart of every man and woman, no matter how humble their station or how hard their lot. This is the legacy of the medieval peasant, a legacy of hope, of resilience, and of the untamed beauty of the human soul. May it guide us and sustain us, now and always, as we make our own way through the winding paths of history, writing our own stories of struggle and triumph, of sorrow and joy, in the great and eternal chronicle of human life. As we've seen, the peat digger's life was one of solitude and struggle, cut off from the daily rhythms and interactions of village society. While the villagers gathered in the square to socialize or sought comfort in their faith at church, the peat digger retreated further into the wilderness of the bog, finding a strange sort of peace in the stillness broken only by the squelch of the spade and the rustle of the wind through the reeds. But even in the margins, in the fringes of the medieval world, there were glimmers of light, of beauty and humanity amidst the hardship. Meg, the peat wife, as she came to be known, was one such glimmer. Toiling alone, season after season in the marshy peat bogs, Meg developed a singular connection to the natural world around her. In stolen moments between the endless labor of cutting and stacking the heavy peat bricks, she began to compose poems, simple, heartfelt verses that captured the subtle changes in the light, filtering through the mists, the sounds of the moorland birds, the small joys of a rare flower blooming in the barren bog. Meg's poems went largely unheard in her lifetime, passed down only in whispered snatches to the few souls she encountered on the peat marsh. But they endured, these humble yet profound expressions of a world-weary spirit, still capable of wonder, just like the peat that she dug from the earth, compressed and preserved through the centuries. In Meg's poetic fragments, we catch a fleeting glimpse of the inner lives of the forgotten folk at the bottom rungs of the feudal world, their dreams and sorrows, their small defiances in the face of a destiny that seemed as fixed and unyielding as the medieval social order itself. For the peasantry as a whole, the daunting edifice of that social order remained very much intact as the Middle Ages slowly crept towards their close. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the largest popular uprising that medieval England had ever seen, had sent tremors through the country after exploding in the streets of London. But it was swiftly and brutally put down, its leaders executed, its promise of change dissolved. And yet, even in defeat, the Peasants' Revolt was a sign of the tectonic shifts starting to stir beneath the surface of the medieval world. The old feudal system, with its rigid hierarchy and unquestioned legitimacy, was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The rise of cities and commerce was giving birth to a new middle class, one that would increasingly challenge the supremacy of the landed aristocracy. The Black Death, the devastating pandemic that had decimated Europe's population a few decades earlier, had also paradoxically strengthened the hand of labor by making it a scarcer resource. So even as the sun set on another long, hard day for the medieval peasantry, the faintest rays of a new dawn were starting to peek over the horizon. Change would come slowly, fitfully, with many setbacks and reversals along the way. But the seeds had been planted, and they would continue to grow in the cracks of the feudal edifice until they finally burst through and remade the world. The medieval peasantry, from the ploughmen in the field to the lowly gong farmer, from the forgotten peat digger to the humble shepherd, may have been condemned to a life of thankless, backbreaking toil. But through that toil, they laid the foundations upon which our modern world would be built. In their struggles, their endurance, their fleeting moments of joy and unvarnished expressions of sorrow, we see a reflection of the human spirit in all its resilient, vulnerable glory. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for Meg, the peat wife, and her brethren, for the poor, benighted peasants of the Middle Ages and all they built and bequeathed to us. In the grand tapestry of human history, they may be the unsung weft threads, hidden behind the glittering warp of kings and conquerors, but without them, there would be no tapestry at all. Sweet dreams, dear listener, And if you enjoyed this boring but edifying meander through medieval history, do consider giving a drowsy thumbs up and subscribing for more soporific, yet strangely stimulating content. Until next time, good night.